The Veil of Egypt, the constitution of the individual and the afterlife in ancient Egypt as portrayed in the Secret Doctrine of H.P. Blavatsky, co-founder of the Theosophical Society. I declare that the Veil of Egypt, the constitution of the individual and the afterlife in ancient Egypt as portrayed in the Secret Doctrine of H.P. Blavatsky, co-founder of the Theosophical Society, is my own work, and that all the sources that I have used or quoted have been indicated and acknowledged by means of complete references. Summary: The Secret Doctrine is the magnum opus of H.P. Blavatsky and one of the foundation texts of the Theosophical Society. It represents her attempt to appropriate authority in a wide variety of fields, including science, religion, and philosophy. This study examines H.P. Blavatsky's engagement with ancient Egypt in relation to two specific themes, the constitution of the individual and the afterlife, as they are portrayed in this work. It locates Theosophy in its historical context, the late 19th century, in relation to various fields of knowledge. It reviews the sources that H.P. Blavatsky drew on in her work and discusses the various interpretive techniques she employed to insert theosophical content into various world religions. Finally, it contrasts the theosophical presentation of ancient Egypt in the Secret Doctrine with that of mainstream modern Egyptology. The fundamental disconnect which is revealed highlights the challenges that the theosophical perspective faces. Key terms: Theosophy, Theosophical Society, Blavatsky, Western Esotericism, Occultism, Ancient Egypt, Comparative Religion, Egyptology, Afterlife, Human Constitution, Secret Doctrine. Acknowledgements. I'd like to thank my supervisor, Professor Cliscon Johnson, whose timely comments and guidance have assisted more than you may know. I thank, also, the University of South Africa for kindly granting me a bursary for part of my studies. This generosity has relieved me of some pressure. This work would also have been difficult to begin without the support of my wife, Assumpta, and my mother, both of whom have contributed in ways they both know. I dedicate this work to my theosophical brother, C.F. He could not write my theosophical story, and I could not write his. His would be the grander tale, and I hope that one day it will be told. Preface: After some 14 years in the freight forwarding industry, I decided to resume my studies in comparative religion at the academic level. I have a relatively long association with Theosophy, having been a member of a Theosophical Society since the early 1990s. While searching for a suitable topic for my dissertation, I chanced upon Erich Horning's The Secret Lore of Egypt, Its Impact on the West. This work is a study of esoteric Egypt throughout history, including a chapter on Theosophy in Egypt. After reading what struck me as an unsatisfactory chapter on the presentation of ancient Egypt in theosophical thought, I felt challenged to investigate the topic in more detail. But breath needs a mind to embrace the universe. Stanzas of Zion. Chapter 1, Introduction and Methodology. 1.1 General background and encounter with Erich Horning's The Secret Lore of Egypt, Its Impact on the West. 1 Prompted my investigation of ancient Egypt as portrayed in the writings of H.P. Blavatsky. Horning's book is a study of esoteric ancient Egypt in the imagination of Western society from antiquity to the present day. In this dissertation I shall examine in detail some of the issues raised by Horning's study. Rudder Hanegraaff has noted that the academic field of Western esotericism is still comparatively new. 1999, page 1. Currently it is still in the process of assuming its legitimate place in the academic arena, although significant strides have been made. In the non-academic world, esoteric books, ideas, and themes are quite pervasive. At this popular level there is often a lack of critical evaluation of sources and ideas, which can reinforce negative stereotypes of both adherents and core ideas. While it is incorrect to generalize, it seems that there can still be a lack of serious engagement with esoteric themes in literature at the academic level. I refer, in part, to academic fields other than the new field of Western esotericism. This situation is, and has been, changing, and esotericism is coming under greater critical scrutiny and evaluation. Similarly, from the theosophical side I have encountered a strain of research with greater emphasis on serious critical studies of theosophical themes, for example in the works of David and Nancy Regal, Hank J. Spearenberg, and David Pratt II. Special mention should be made of the scholarly journal Theosophical History, which is dedicated to the academic investigation of theosophical topics. 1.2 Research Problem and Objectives. This dissertation is intended to be a contribution to the field of Western esoteric studies. The way in which H.P. Blavatsky engages with religion in general, and with any particular religion specifically, could be complete topics for dissertations in themselves. I intend to focus on a particular section of her statements in respect of ancient Egypt as presented in the Secret Doctrine. 3. I will specifically examine H.P. Blavatsky's statements in relation to ancient Egypt which deal with the constitution of the individual and the afterlife. These are interrelated topics. Far more could be said concerning the way H.P. Blavatsky engages with ancient Egypt as a whole, for example, the macrocosm, creation accounts, and the history and chronology of ancient Egypt. For the purposes of this dissertation, however, I have narrowed my focus to an aspect of her larger engagement with ancient Egypt. The object of my study, or the unit of analysis, is the Secret Doctrine of H.P. Blavatsky. My primary aim will be to state, examine, and assess her statements on the constitution of the person and the afterlife in relation to ancient Egypt as advanced in this central work of hers. The main aim of my dissertation will be to state, in theosophical terminology, her teachings on these topics. I will look to examining her work for internal consistency and/or inconsistency. The question of internal consistency is important as the foundation of the theosophical endeavor is that of an ancient wisdom tradition carried from the past and revealed again by H.P. Blavatsky. It is said to have a scientific, verifiable base, and as such should not be internally inconsistent. In addition, its origin is located in individuals who have unique access to truth to the point where error is, from a theosophical perspective, almost impossible. Notions of truth and scientific and how these are understood by H.P. Blavatsky and her writings will form aspects of my work. I have identified two secondary aims. Firstly, I intend to examine H.P. Blavatsky's statements on these themes in the religion of ancient Egypt in relation to the current mainstream views of Egyptology. Secondly, I will examine her use of her contemporary textual sources for and the various strategies she invoked to draw these sources into her overarching theosophical scheme. A number of issues are raised in relation to my main objective. Firstly, can the Secret Doctrine be separated from H.P. Blavatsky's other writings? Secondly, why the Secret Doctrine? What place or status does this work have in the theosophical oeuvre? In response to the first point, I suggest that, while the Secret Doctrine is a discrete text, it is not possible to isolate it totally from the balance of her writings. The Secret Doctrine draws on her earlier work, and it is projected into the future by being referenced in later writings. Particularly relevant are volumes 12 and 14 of her collected works, and Isis Unveiled. Portions of these volumes from her collected works are believed to have been intended to form a third and fourth volume of her Secret Doctrine. 5. I will, therefore, draw on H.P. Blavatsky's other writings quite frequently. The Secret Doctrine is, however, regarded as her magnum opus in defining work. 6. In response to the second point, I will outline the place of the Secret Doctrine, not in the light of its place in any particular theosophical society, i.e. how any set or subset of members values the work, but rather in relation to H.P. Blavatsky's own referencing statements regarding this work. This is an important point as I have met many theosophists who do not engage with the Secret Doctrine in any direct way. Despite this, the Secret Doctrine has an authoritative place in the Theosophical Society which cannot be easily gainsaid. Any theosophical work is valued according to its authorship or inspiration. The more directly a text is authored or inspired by the Mahatmas, adept masters of Theosophy, the more authoritative the work is. Possibly the most authoritative work in Theosophy would then be the Mahatma letters to A.P. Sinnett. I will, however, outline in detail the place of the Secret Doctrine in the dissertation. I will further suggest that there is a specific theosophical meaning set, developed by H.P. Blavatsky and others, into which all imported religious terms and ideas need to be translated for them to be correctly understood in the theosophical context. Many of these theosophical terms were drawn from religions of the world, for example Ottoman, Buddha, etc., and form part of the theosophical language. However, they take on specific meaning in the theosophical context. This terminology was evolved by H.P. Blavatsky and others, and it includes terms and phrases such as root races, rounds, first, second and third logos, chans, 7 planes of existence, and any number of others. The specific terms can be reviewed in any standard theosophical glossary. The theosophical terminology must be carefully explained for it to be evaluated. This is important as the theosophical endeavor involves an interpretation of world religions. In order to understand H.P. Blavatsky's intent, one needs to understand the basic meanings associated with theosophical words, many of which have alternate meanings in other contexts. With regard to the first of my secondary aims, relating H.P. Blavatsky's ideas on the set topics. In relation to the position of modern Egyptology, it is important to state that it is not my intent either to prove or disprove her position. I hope instead to make clear her stance in relation to modern mainstream Egyptology. Modern Egyptology is a wide field, and I will locate H.P. Blavatsky's ideas in this broader field. In general, certain esoteric notions are rejected by the mainstream scholars such as Erich Horning and Jan Osman. There is, however, also a limited trend in Egyptology which does include some esoteric perspectives. A scholar in this field would be Jeremy Naylor. It is not my opinion that the esotericism, rather mysticism, Naylor discusses mirrors the theosophical position. I shall, however, review this briefly in the dissertation. With the second of my secondary aims, I will examine the ways in which H.P. Blavatsky injects new meaning into existing religious terms and ideas. Through a process of selection, appropriation, and rejection, she transforms existing concepts and draws them into her theosophical structure. The way in which Egypt as a concept and a set of religious doctrines is drawn into the Secret Doctrine will form a part of my dissertation. In terms of identifying the sources she drew on, Boris Zirkov, editor of H.P. Blavatsky's collected works, has done important research in this area, and I will make reference to this where it is applicable. 1.3 Structure of the dissertation and chapter outline. The way in which I intend to accomplish the above is through a textual analysis of H.P. Blavatsky's magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine. The first 3 chapters present historical and background material. Chapters 4 and 5 deal specifically with the Theosophical Egyptian material. In chapters 4 and 5 I will address each theme in a basic threefold pattern. Firstly, I will present the general theosophical statement on the topic in its own terms. Secondly, I will extract selected readings on the chosen themes from the writings of H.P. Blavatsky and add explanatory comments. Thirdly, I will present the mainstream perspective of modern Egyptology on the selected themes and briefly compare them to the theosophical position. I have deliberately made use of extensive quotations from the writings of H.P. Blavatsky. It is my intention to allow her works to speak directly for themselves. Some theosophical writings can be complex and arcane to readers unfamiliar with them, and I, therefore, contextualize and comment on the selected passages where necessary. The scope of the topics on ancient Egypt covered will be guided by H.P. Blavatsky's references in the Secret Doctrine. In this dissertation I do not intend to examine Egypt beyond H.P. Blavatsky's own specific references. To clarify her ideas I will, where relevant, take the wider context of her writings on ancient Egypt into account. The nature of the theosophical engagement with many religions is sporadic and fragmented, so, therefore, my control over the content of the dissertation will be limited. I feel, however, that her statements are sufficiently linked to allow me to organize them into intelligible categories. In Chapter 1, this chapter, I provide a general introduction to the scope, aim, and methodology that will be followed to examine the topic. I present a literature survey and comment on studies related to mine. In Chapter 2, I place Theosophy in its general historical background, including the intellectual currents of the time and in the field of Egyptology. This chapter will include a sketch of sources drawn on by H.P. Blavatsky and her presentation of ancient Egypt. I will specifically discuss the Egyptian Book of the Dead, its place in the Egyptian religion, and translations used by H.P. Blavatsky in her writings. I will also outline the place of the Secret Doctrine in the Theosophical corpus. Chapter 3 is a theoretical examination of how H.P. Blavatsky viewed and engaged with the Religions of the world and with the concept of religion itself. I will outline Theosophy's own understanding of its place within these categories and examine how it inserts itself into world religions and appropriates them into its overarching scheme. Chapter 4 begins with a study of how the human individual, the microcosm, is presented in Theosophy, followed by a selection of extracts on this topic with specific relation to ancient Egypt. It concludes with a comparison of the theosophical presentation of the individual in ancient Egypt in contrast to the current mainstream views in Egyptology. Chapter 5 outlines and compares Egyptian and theosophical concepts of the afterlife. This ties in neatly with the theme of Chapter 4, as it is the individual who enters the afterlife. The way in which H.P. Blavatsky conceptualizes these themes in the Egyptian religious tradition forms a basis for comparison with modern Egyptological studies. Chapter 6 is a general summing up and conclusion. The bibliography and reference section is a combined list of sources referenced in the dissertation and sources which I have consulted in preparation for this study. Some of the works listed will simply be bibliographical entries for works cited by H.P. Blavatsky. The first appendix is a chronological table of the Egyptian dynasties. The second appendix is a study of reincarnation in ancient Egypt as presented by H.P. Blavatsky. I review this in relation to the mainstream conception in the modern field of Egyptology. Reincarnation is a fundamental teaching of Theosophy and must be located in any religion which is said to represent the ancient wisdom tradition of Theosophy. It is my intent to review the extent to which reincarnation is seen as a part of the Egyptian religion by modern scholars of Egyptology, and what implications this has for the theosophical mode of interpretation. In Appendix 3 I go into detail in an attempt to distinguish between the types of statements made in the Secret Doctrine. The measure of a statement is whether it is definitive or not. The question of authority and the nature of many theosophical statements remove them from the realm of simple opinion and place them in the realm of indisputable truth claims. In this appendix I extract sample statements and review them in terms of authority. Appendix 4 is a table drawn from de Zirkoff's divine plan which shows the unfolding of the theosophical human principles during the rounds. In Appendix 5, theosophical statements on mummification are briefly discussed and related to the mainstream contemporary ideas of Egyptology. Appendix 6 presents a provisional table of correspondences of human principles drawn from various theosophical authors. 1.4 Methodological background. For the following brief discussion on methodology I draw extensively on Hanegraaff, 1995-7. The general methodological background is that of empirical historical approach. This allows space for the texts to speak for themselves without reducing statements to epiphenomena subservient to larger theoretical agendas. It also avoids the pitfalls of perennialism and its purported unscientific approach to ideas. Hanegraaff outlines this empirical method as an alternative to what he calls reductionist and religionist approaches. This empirical approach is characterized by a number of assumptions. A. It does not accept any axiomatic beliefs about the ultimate nature of reality. Hanegraaff. 1995, page 2, i.e. it is a methodological agnosticism. Preconceived assumptions as to the nature of reality color the interpretations of both reductionist and religionist approaches. B. It involves a criticism of ideologies which limit the domain in which science may speak legitimately with authority. Hanegraaff 1995, page 3c. It implies that we have access to religions as human events only in space and time. Hanegraaff 1995, page 3. One of the chief criticisms of this empirical historical approach is its seeming inability to explain religion. Its reflective and descriptive nature does not allow it to provide any fundamental explanation of religion, and it cannot, therefore, be regarded as a science. This criticism is in part accepted by Hanegraaff, who counters that radical explanations have rooted metaphysical assumptions which are unscientific themselves. It is more constructive to admit we are unable to uncover what religion is really about than to impose metaphysical assumptions onto religious phenomena. A further potential criticism is mentioned by Nadler when he refers to Henri Corbin's notion of agnostic reflex. This agnostic approach does not allow the academic interpreter to do justice to the actual experienced reality of the cultural participants being examined. He argues that a sympathetic engagement with religious texts based on a phenomenological approach provides a sounder perspective on these issues. 2005, page 321. This is a contested issue with merits for each perspective. For my purposes in this dissertation, I note that Nadler is writing specifically on the ancient Egyptian religion. He is concerned with how Egyptians experienced their reality, for example the underworld, the gods, etc. However, am not engaging directly with ancient Egypt or with how Egyptians experienced their world. Nor am I specifically engaging with how Theosophists experience their afterlife concepts or their gods. My focus is on the Theosophical reading of ancient Egypt. The Theosophical reading and appropriation of ancient Egypt is an intellectual and literary process which poses questions different from those relating to experience. I will argue that a rational process of appropriation was undertaken by H.P. Blavatsky in bringing ancient Egypt into the Theosophical scheme. To this I would add that a clear expression of religious thought, in its own terms, is fundamental to its further evaluation, whether by social scientific reductionist methods or by perennialist approaches. The primary aim of this dissertation is to state H.P. Blavatsky's thoughts on the chosen themes of ancient Egypt and the vocabulary developed by her, and others, in her major work, The Secret Doctrine. The historical descriptive method is well suited to this endeavor. 1.5 Literature Survey. My topic is quite specific, so I would be primarily interested in works which engage with both Theosophy and ancient Egypt. To assess H.P. Blavatsky's contribution sufficiently, however, I would need also to review works on ancient Egypt and Theosophy as separate entities. The ideal literature I hope to engage in would have been studies which related to both Theosophy and ancient Egypt, as concepts like objective and scholarly can be loaded terms. I have provisionally divided the types of engagement with Theosophical Egypt into three categories. There are those works which very critically dispute Theosophical and Theosophical type statements on ancient Egypt, those which, uncritically and sympathetically, support Theosophical statements, and those which are more reflective and objective in nature. Any particular study on the topic may reflect one or more of the above stances, good or poor. Research may also characterize any of the above positions. For example, the fact that a study may be written by a professional academic may not necessarily mean it is any more thorough or objective than that penned by a member of the Theosophical Society. I think, however, it is fair to say that, in my experience, member-penned studies can fail to meet basic research criteria. For example, referencing, examination of sources, critical reflection, and attention to studies critical of Theosophical teachings. This does in part, however, reflect the context, audience, and intent of Theosophical writings. An example of a critical look at Theosophical statements on ancient Egypt is Eric Horning's The Secret Lore of Egypt, Its Impact on the West. Eric Horning has outlined the fascination the West has had with ancient Egypt from classical times to the modern day. His orienting idea is a distinction he introduces between academic Egyptology and what he labels Egyptosophy. Egyptology would be understood as being the academic discipline engaging in the study of ancient Egypt. It only began as a legitimate science in 1822 when Champollion, through the Rosetta Stone, deciphered hieroglyphics. Prior to this event, no truly scientific study of ancient Egypt had been possible. I am inclined to agree that the inability to decipher hieroglyphics would have been a serious, virtually insurmountable, obstacle to an examination of Egyptian beliefs. By the neologism Egyptosophy, Horning refers to the study of an imaginary Egypt viewed as the profound source of all esoteric lore. Horning 2001, page 3, This Imaginary Egypt. According to Horning, has no real relationship to Egypt proper. Horning argues that these two disciplines are not to be mixed. One is the systematic, serious study of ancient sources, while the other is rooted in revelatory, intuitive, and non-rational processes. One is the objective study of its sources, while the other has unstated aims, namely relating to locating pre-existing esoteric themes in the text, for example secret knowledge and initiations, and links to ancient cultures, Atlantis, Lemuria, etc. Important in this context is Horning's view of esoteric matters, which he writes, have to do with hidden, often deliberately concealed truths that can be grasped only through intuition or revelation and that elude any and all experimental verifications. Horning 2001, page 3. Horning deals with Theosophy in a short chapter, 14 pages long, entitled Theosophy and Anthroposophy. Of these 14 pages, 6 deal with Theosophy proper. The balance discusses the Anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner. Of the 6 pages dealing with Theosophy, only 3 or so deal with Blavatsky's actual contribution to the topic. He then moves his attention to the later Theosophical Society under Annie Besant and C.W. Ledbetter. He includes a discussion of Krishnamurti, the point of which in relation to his main theme eludes me. I feel 3 issues are raised by Horning's chapter on Theosophy. Firstly, he does not actually directly engage in detail with any theosophical text. This can be gauged from his references. Secondly, as H.P. Blavatsky was writing after the deciphering of hieroglyphics, and she had access to reliable translations of Egyptian text, it can only be an assumption to dismiss her works as Egyptosophical without a proper study of them. 8. Thirdly, his notion of esotericism as having only an irrational and revelatory base does not do full justice to the term as used in the academic field, nor to H.P. Blavatsky's attempt to present her teachings in rational, logical, and scientific fashion. His general distinction between Egyptology and Egyptosophy could perhaps also be problematical. I feel, however, that he has made a powerful point in relation to the decipherment of hieroglyphics and its necessity for an understanding of Egyptian thought. There are a number of sympathetic member-written books and Theosophical Journal articles. From the time of H.P. Blavatsky to the present, I have come across a recent, representative work of this type of theosophical engagement with Egypt, a work by John Gordon entitled Egypt, Child of Atlantis, A Radical Interpretation of the Origins of Civilization, 2004-9. Gordon's book falls neatly into the theosophical tradition of interpreting religion. All the themes H.P. Blavatsky raised around ancient Egypt are taken up in Egypt, Child of Atlantis. There is the concern with the age of Egyptian civilization, the notions of an esoteric knowledge revealed during initiations inside the Great Pyramid, Egypt's relationship with Atlantis, and so on. Carrying on in the Blavatsky tradition is also Gordon's ambivalent assessment of modern science and archaeology. For Gordon, the current archaeological position on the age of Egyptian civilization is willfully myopic, Gordon 2004, page 1. He is also appreciative of some amateur or alternative studies, by authors such as John Anthony West, Robert Bauval, and Graham Hancock, to the point where he can write. But if modern scientists and scholars do not clearly understand something, they should unashamedly admit the fact together with the shortcomings and limitations of their current stock of knowledge, rather than fudging the issue with technical and technological hocus-pocus while gratuitously deriding the considered thoughts of others, outside or on the fringes of their own discipline. Gordon 2004, page 7. Gordon's special contribution is the use of theosophical and esoteric interpretations and teachings. He has drawn relatively uncritically from H.P. Blavatsky's and other theosophists' works, interpreting the Egyptian gods in a theosophical fashion, using our theme of earlier advanced civilizations preceding the Egyptian and retaining our sevenfold division of man. This work does share a certain amount in common with what I hope to achieve in this dissertation. Gordon has used H.P. Blavatsky's insights and teachings, among others, to come to his conclusions about ancient Egypt. His however, is not a systematic evaluation of H.P. Blavatsky's statements, which is what I intend to undertake. Gordon's Theosophically. Colored work is precisely what Eric Horning wishes to distinguish from academic Egyptology. Both the works discussed above have a polemical nature about them. One is predisposed to accept theosophical statements, the other to dismiss them. An example of a type of study which falls somewhere between these two extremes is an article by Antonios Goyos entitled, Essay Mackey and the Dendera Zodiacs, 2009. H.P. Blavatsky drew quite frequently on the works of Samson Arnold Mackey, 1765–1843, a self-taught scholar who penned various works on equinoctial precession, ancient history, and mythology. Goyos 2009, page 1, specifically, she adopts his conclusions concerning the precessional cycle and the Dendera zodiacs to support her dating of Egyptian civilization. Goyos has examined Mackey's use of his sources and feels that Mackey has not correctly interpreted the works at hand. Mackey has drawn conclusions, which his sources do not support and which were subsequently drawn into the Secret Doctrine by H.P. Blavatsky. If indeed Mackey has misinterpreted his source material, and if these misinterpretations were drawn into the Secret Doctrine, it would have implications for the status of the Secret Doctrine. The work of Goyos is closest to what I hope to achieve in this dissertation. He has, however, perhaps gone deeper into a particular topic than I am capable of here. I would like to say I could multiply the examples of the three types of studies, but that is not the case with the exception of theosophical-based research. Horning's work is the only mainstream academic writing from a recognized Egyptologist I have found on this topic. It does not, however, in my opinion engage sufficiently with theosophical sources. The article by Goyos is the only article of which I am thus far aware that both honestly engages with theosophical resources and critically assesses them. He does not appear to have entered the debate with predetermined answers. Some of the articles found on David Pratt's website, for example, The Great Pyramid, also approach objectivity and critical scholarship. Theosophical studies on ancient Egypt are to be found, although not perhaps in the quantity one may expect for so central an esoteric theme as Egypt. P.W. Bullock delivered 2 lectures, Hermetic Philosophy and Egyptian Belief Theosophically Considered, which were published respectively in 1892 in the Theosophist magazine and 1893 fourths in Theosophical Siftings. An important early theosophist, Alexander Wilder, published a series of articles on the history of Egypt by dynasty in 1899 in the Theosophical periodical, Universal Brotherhood. There is an important article by L. Wellens and I. M. Oderberg in the Theosophical Forum in 1941 entitled, Egyptian Teachings in the Light of Theosophy. I have drawn on this article for a theosophical perspective on ancient Egypt. There are various articles by Boris Tazurkov, Charles J. Ryan and F. J. Dick, on ancient Egypt from a theosophical perspective in the Theosophical Path magazine. A certain Opiniano wrote a 2-part article in the Theosophical Journal Filhot entitled, The Initiation Procedure Within the Great Pyramid of Giza, Egypt, Original Theosophy Challenges the Mausoleums, Dogma of the Egyptologists. There are also a number of articles by the theosophical authors I. M. Oderberg and Gerald J. Schuler to be found in the Sunrise magazine. An article entitled Septenary Man in Ancient Egypt by Hetep and Netter appeared in the Theosophical Quarterly magazine in 1937. There is also a short book entitled The Faith of Ancient Egypt by Sidney G. P. Corin, published in 1913 by the Theosophical Publishing Company. For the sake of completeness, mention can be made of Alvin Boyd Kuhn's, in part theosophically inspired, The Lost Light, in Interpretation of Ancient Scriptures, 1940. This work is so startling in its idiosyncratic perspective on ancient Egypt that if its positions were ever proven justified it would herald a true revolution in Egyptology. I do not believe more could be said on this work. There would be others, and this list is intended to be representative, not exhaustive. The theosophical-based articles are, in the main, characterized by attempts to support theosophical statements, and they are relatively uncritical of statements by H.P. Blavatsky. They are rooted in the primary statements of H.P. Blavatsky and are concerned with elaborating them. They, like H.P. Blavatsky, drew on contemporary sources where they supported theosophical statements and rejected those which did not support them. The themes remain the same as those found in the Secret Doctrine, that is, initiations, the great antiquity of Egypt, esoteric knowledge, astrological and zodiacal knowledge, and so on. 1.6 Limitations. It should be mentioned that my research has been carried out in English. In the light of this language constraint, I have examined only the English language sources, and those sources which have been translated into English, of H.P. Blavatsky. This has not affected my chief objective of stating the theosophical position and relating it to current views in Egyptology. H.P. Blavatsky wrote all her important works in English, and many of the works she used as resources have been translated. Some of the sources she used, however, were in various continental languages and have not been translated. A great deal of work in Egyptology has also been written about in German and French, and I am able to review this, where applicable, only in translation. I feel that the general, and scattered, presentation of Egypt in the Secret Doctrine makes English resources quite sufficient to cover any topics raised. A second limitation relates to the supporting theosophical literature, which I shall draw on in explanation of the key concepts of H.P. Blavatsky. The Theosophical Society has split into three main divisions: the Theosophical Society Adyar, the Theosophical Society Pasadena, and the ULT, or United Lodge of Theosophists. These divisions are long-standing and have resulted in each of the societies producing its own specific secondary literature. All three societies, however, accept the basic original literature of the movement, i.e. the works of the founders, the Mahatma letters to AP Senate, and so on. It is beyond the scope of this dissertation to review the explanatory literature on Egypt and Theosophy of each society. In this dissertation I have relied mainly on the literature of the Pasadena Theosophical Society. I have, however, drawn on at least one major work which is respected by each society, and that is Barberka's The Divine Plan. My motivation for choosing Pasadena-based literature is personal preference in my assessment that the literature of that society remains closer in spirit and teaching to that of the original founders of the Theosophical Society. It is my intent, however, to root myself where possible in the statements of the Secret Doctrine, and I refer to later works only for clarity and explanation when necessary. For the contemporary mainstream position of Egyptology, I have drawn primarily on the works of Eric Horning, Jan Osman, Salima Ikram, and John Taylor. Special mention should also be made of Louis V. Zabkar's work, A Study of the Ba Concept in Ancient Egyptian Texts, whose perspective on the Egyptian understanding of the individual I have adopted. Egyptology is a wide and specialized field, and I have relied on specific sources which may not reflect the entire range of positions available. A third limitation, or perhaps omission, is that I have not located the position of H.P. Blavatsky on ancient Egypt in her contemporary era. Egyptology as a field has evolved considerably from the 19th century, and some of the positions she held may have had a more solid basis when contextualized within the ambience of this early Egyptology. I believe there would be definite value in locating her statements on Egypt in their historical context. My interest in this dissertation, however, is how her statements compare to the views of modern Egyptology. For the most part I will use anglicized forms for Eastern and Egyptian terms. 1.7 Conclusion. I hope this dissertation will define the statements of H.P. Blavatsky in her magnum opus, the Secret Doctrine, on the themes of the constitution of the individual and the afterlife as they relate to ancient Egypt. Chapter 2, Historical Background. Chapter 2 outlines a number of related issues which will contextualize H.P. Blavatsky's presentation of ancient Egypt. I will locate the Theosophical Society in its 19th century context, and outline the state of Egyptology in the same era. From the Theosophical side, I discuss the place of H.P. Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine and her oeuvre. This discussion will include identifying some of the possible sources of information on Egypt that H.P. Blavatsky drew on, and a section on the Egyptian Book of the Dead. 2.1 The late 19th century, archaeology, science, religion, and the Theosophical Society. In this subsection I intend to outline the general historical context into which the Theosophical Society was born. I will sketch the various social, intellectual, and cultural forces and institutions with which Theosophy was in contact and conflict. It is not my intention to give a detailed account of the historical background of each element, but rather to mention a few general points which relate to the Theosophical Society. Goodrick Clark notes, and my dissertation will proceed on this basis, that we should recall that the Theosophical Society had its intellectual and social origins in the English-speaking world, irrespective of her own continental background in Russia and France. Blavatsky formulated her occult debut as a response to the Anglo-American interest in mesmerism and spiritualism. She was neither influenced nor particularly aware of German nature philosophy. 2003, page 17. While not all developments in the sciences, religion and other fields of knowledge were being made in the English-speaking world, H.P. Blavatsky may have known of them, though this English prism. In many cases the relationship was ambivalent, while, on the one hand, many of the intellectual currents appeared to be in basic opposition to Theosophy, on the other, such was their authority in society that they needed to be engaged with and appropriated by H.P. Blavatsky. The late 19th century was a critical point in the history of the West. Judging from academic studies on Theosophy, the Theosophical Society is located securely in the milieu of late 19th century Europe and America. The late 19th century contained no single theme, or strand, or cultural environment. The elements range from scientific and archaeological advances to an interest in occultism and exotic religions. The Theosophy of H.P. Blavatsky, and in particular her Secret Doctrine, present one focal point of these various competing and complementing strands. The Secret Doctrine is H.P. Blavatsky's attempt to integrate these larger strands into a unifying whole, one in which the strands are subordinated to her synthesizing presentation. She was not alone in this attempt to integrate knowledge as it was unfolding in the 19th century. From science to philosophy to religion, all endeavors of human understanding were obliged to respond to the changes which were occurring. All were competing for cultural supremacy and authority. Some were on the ascendant, science; some on the decline, traditional Christianity; and some, like the Theosophical Society, were marginal bodies looking for their place in the sun, for example, spiritualism. Some of the elements and institutions to which Theosophy stands in relation, and with which it engages in one way or another, are listed by H.P. Blavatsky in her Isis Unveiled. They are Christians, scientists, pseudo-scientists, broad churchmen and freethinkers, mercenaries, and parasites of the press, men of letters and various authorities and spiritualists. 1988, Volume I, pg. 8x. To these one must add the occult tradition, non-spiritualist, of Europe and America, and the increasing exposure to Eastern religions in the West. That she does not mention the latter two may give us a clue as to where she felt aligned. 2.1.1 The Theosophical Society. The two chief founders of the Theosophical Society were H.P. Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, née Hahn, was born between August 11 and 12, 1831 in Ekaterinoslav, Russia. Following her mother's death in 1842, she was raised by her grandparents in Saratov and Tiflis. By all accounts she was exposed early on to esoteric literature through her grandmother's father, Prince Pavel Dolgorukov, who had a large library of esoteric books and links to Rosicrucian and Masonic circles. She had an abortive marriage. to Nikifor Blavatsky in 1849, a marriage from which she fled almost immediately. She traveled throughout the world visiting, among others places, Egypt. In 1850, in Cairo, she reportedly studied with a Copt magician, Polos Medalon, whom she met again between 1869 and 1872. Goodrick Clark, 2004, page 23. It was in 1851 that she records her first meeting with one of the Theosophical Mahatmas. One H. B. Blavatsky passed away on May 8, 1891. H. S. Olcott was born on August 2, 1832 in New Jersey, USA. He had a background in agriculture, and he was made a colonel in the U.S. Army following his work in investigating fraud. In 1868, he was admitted as a lawyer at the New York Bar Association. Throughout this time he maintained an interest in metaphysical and spiritualist issues, publishing articles in a spiritualist journal, The Banner of Light, among others. H. P. Blavatsky and H. S. Olcott met in October 1874 in Chittenden, Vermont. It was here that the Eddy mediums held sittings and where H. P. Blavatsky and Olcott became friends. They met, therefore, in the popular milieu of spiritualism, Gomez suggesting that up to 1/5 of the American population were spiritualists. Gomez, 1987, page 19. The spiritualist movement formed one of the important background strands which informed and shaped the Theosophical Society. The details of the actual founding of the Theosophical Society are often recorded in studies of Theosophy. In Theosophical histories, it was under the instruction of H. P. Blavatsky's teachers that an attempt was made to form a society to tell the truth, too, and which would be philosophic, religious, and scientific. Ryan, 1975, page 50, as Cranston relates, on September 7, 1875, a number of people met in the quarters of H. P. Blavatsky in New York. The immediate reason for the meeting was to receive a lecture by George H. Felt entitled, The Lost Canon of Proportion of the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. Following this presentation, an idea was floated among H. P. Blavatsky, H. S. Olcott, and W. Q. Judge to form a society to study these types of knowledge. The official founding of the Theosophical Society is regarded as November 17, 1875, with its inaugural address. Cranston, 1994, page 143 to 147. The purpose of the Theosophical Society and internal histories is summed up by its three objectives. 1. To form the nucleus of universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. 2. To promote the study of Aryan and other Eastern literatures, religions, and sciences. And 3. To investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the psychical powers in man. 3. Blavatsky, 1987, page 306. Modern research into the founding of the Theosophical Society now questions the original motivations and suggests a more practical occult agenda was intended. 4. As Stephen Prothero has convincingly shown, the form the Theosophical Society took was shaped by the differing personalities of the two founders. H. P. Blavatsky represented an aristocratic, elitist, and esoteric stream, while H. S. Olcott represented a genteel, democratic, and liberal tradition. 1993, page 209. Campbell characterizes this tension as a conflict between mysticism and established organization. 1980, page 97. This opposition does much to explain many of the inherent tensions in the structure and organization of the Theosophical Society. There have been a number of schisms in the Theosophical Society. There is the original society, the Idea Theosophical Society, whose notable leaders were Annie Besant and C. W. Ledbetter, the society formed by W. Q. Judge, the Pasadena Theosophical Society, and the United Lodge of Theosophists of Robert Crosby. While each society has its distinctive feel and focus, and each is historically separate, my following comments will be based on a general impression. 5. Within any lodge one may find a continuum of experience potential. A lodge may be orientated towards individual experience, mystical, for want of a better term, against a lodge environment focus on intellectual inquiry. A lodge may encourage open inquiry by members, or it may be focused more narrowly on imparting received theosophical teachings. Related to this, a lodge may have a focus on general esoteric matters, for example astrology, healing, etc., with weak links only to theosophical content, or it may be focused more specifically on the theosophical content. This open versus closed dichotomy is both a strength and weakness of the Theosophical Society. I have little doubt that it is one of the contributing factors to the gradual decline of the society in terms of membership. The organizational openness gives the potential new member almost no sense of belonging, while the doctrinal, closed system, when actually presented in a lodge, is found to be too prescriptive. 2.1.2 Spiritualism. The Hydesville rappings of the Fox sisters in 1848 ignited an interest in spiritualism in the United States of America. While the phenomena were not new, Godwin notes that the publicity which surrounded these events allowed the Fox sisters to become professional mediums. 1994, page 188, this movement became very popular and widespread, while it retained its greatest influence in the United States. H.P. Blavatsky had a history of involvement in the spiritualist movement. She was herself a medium and had been involved in defending mediumistic phenomenon. Spiritualism was one of the battleground fronts between the engagement of religion and science. It was also one of the vehicles of the Western esoteric tradition. She would eventually break with spiritualism both practically and philosophically. Prothero divides the history of the Theosophical Society into an early and late period. The late period represents the more familiar Theosophical Society, engaging with Eastern religions and comparative study. It is the Theosophical Society as it now exists. This late period began with the arrival of founders in India in 1879. This is post the writing of Isis Unveiled, 1877, in which the Western atmosphere of the teachings was still predominant. The early period of the Society reflects a greater concern with phenomena, spiritualism, and practical occultism. 1993, page 198, Prothero argues that the early theosophical agenda was concerned with transforming gross spiritualism into a more philosophical, intellectual, and elitist movement. It retained its interest in the third objective of the Theosophical Society, but began to move towards more sophisticated explanations of the phenomena. The theosophical criticism of spiritualism was based on a moral and intellectual shift which eventually led to the establishment of the Mahatmas as the model of humanity in the Theosophical Society. The authority of passive, chiefly female, mediums in spiritualism gave way to the adepts of the Theosophical Society. Increasingly intellectual and scientific explanations of phenomena were introduced by the Theosophical Society, and this was in tune with the larger process of appropriating the scientific discourse and authority into the society. 2.1.3 Science and Religion in the Late 19th Century. The advances in the sciences in the late 19th century demanded a response from all institutions with a stake in the cultural, religious, and intellectual life of that period. Responses could in theory range from complete acceptance of the new thoughts to a complete rejection. A variety of positions could be taken in between. The Theosophical Society represents one type of response from the religious sphere. Science itself was not a uniform, unambivalent body of uncontested knowledge. Within the scientific field were competing views. Richard Tarnas notes two cultural streams. There was the scientific enlightenment and its shadow. Romanticism. 1999, page 366. The first was materialistic, characterized by objectivism, positivism, reductionism and determinism. Lehman, 1998, page 97. Romanticism projected a more holistic paradigm into which, intuitively, one would feel Theosophy would fit. Naturally, Tarnas, in fact, notes Theosophy as being one of the representatives of the Romantic Spirit. 1999, page 372, as I review his description of the romantic versus the scientific. Enlightenment attitudes, however, I feel struck by how Theosophy seems to straddle both perspectives. The rational presentation of Theosophy, the determined presentation of truth, and the view of nature as something to be understood and classified, the careful, ordered delineation of the planes and principles, for example, seems almost as much scientific as romantic in nature. These two perspectives permeated each other in various ways, and Theosophy reflects this in its expression. Nor was the seeming conflict between science and religion the only way in which these two institutionalized bodies of knowledge engaged each other. The instance of the Theosophical Society, for example, cannot simply be resolved into a single category of conflict with science. The adoption of scientific concepts, terms, and ideas into the theosophical system suggests that other forces were also at play. The traditional forms of Christianity were on the defensive in the face of scientific advances. The 1860 debate between T.H. Huxley and Bishop Wilberforce, along with the publication of Darwin's theory of evolution, were seen to be turning points in the history of science and religion. Advances in biblical criticism had also diluted the past authority of the churches. In particular, 3 scientific theories challenged any traditional presentation of religion. These were 1. Dalton's atomic theory of matter, 2. The theory of the conservation of energy, and 3. Evolution. Lightman, 2001, page 346. It has been suggested that it is the second idea which was the most challenging to a religious presentation of the world. In its materialistic form it did away with any space for divine or supernatural interference in nature. The main version of science in the English-speaking world was scientific naturalism. Lightman notes that scientific naturalism was naturalistic in the sense that it would permit no recourse to causes not empirically observable in nature, and scientific as it was built on the 3 theories mentioned above: atomic theory, conservation of energy, and evolution. 2001, page 346. Scientific naturalists were determined to become the accepted voice of science in society and thereby wield its authority. They were aiming for science to be the guiding light of cultural authority, and they hoped that scientists would replace the clergy as the leaders in society. Where would the Theosophical Society fit into this field of forces competing for authority and preeminence in the late 19th century? Santucci remarks, the roots of the Theosophical Society may be found in the fascination with science and the increasingly popular view during the second half of the 19th century that the spiritual realm was scientifically verifiable and that its inhabitants, spirits, were in communication with the physical realm. 2012, page 2. It is important to note that science as a field was not a uniform body, it was divided amongst itself. Regardless of which faction or positions may finally have won the day, in the late 19th century, science, like archaeology, was in a process of development and self-definition. I will briefly focus on a book by one such group of scientists who were competing with the scientific naturalists, the North British physicists. Bernard Lightman, in his illuminating article, Victorian Sciences and Religions, Discordant Harmonies, has brought this group into focus, and their relevance to my dissertation is that it was members of this group who published a work which has recently been found to have had an important influence on certain ideas of H.P. Blavatsky. The essence of the various disputes between these two groups is not especially relevant to my larger thesis, which is that there were during H.P. Blavatsky's time, competing views within the scientific community itself. North British 7 group members, like William Thomson, James Clerk Maxwell, Peter Guthrie Tait and others, had gained national and even international credibility in the field of energy science. Although their ideas were informed by religious sentiment, they were credible and legitimate scientists, even by the standards of scientific naturalists. They could not, therefore, simply be dismissed in the same way that ministers and the clergy could be. Nicholas Goodrich Clark has highlighted the fact that science was assimilated into the occult. Discourse to produce a Scientific Occultism '8, 2003, page 5. This use of scientific works is more than just a facade through which esoteric ideas are simply restated in a new era. The ideas of science are drawn into, and inform, esoteric thought. There was a variety of scientific positions to choose from, and certainly pre-existing esoteric ideas 9 would have, in part, guided which version of science was adopted. 10 Goodrich Clark has drawn attention to a work by two North British-Scottish physicists which H.P. Blavatsky made use of, viz. The Unseen Universe, of Physical Speculations on a Future State, published in 1875. 2003, page 5. This work, written by Balfour Stewart and P.G. Tate in 1875, was intended as a refutation of John Tyndall's 1874 Belfast Address, where he proposed a strictly materialistic view of nature, drawing on Victorian physics, including the ether, the conservation of energy, the vortex atom, and the second law of thermodynamics. They proposed a concept of nature which included an invisible realm in addition to the visible. Hyman, 1972, page 76. This unseen universe was in communication with the visible order of nature, and they proposed a hierarchy of beings which connected these two realms. The realm of the miraculous and supernatural in this scheme could now be classified within the boundaries of science. Many of these ideas are reflected in theosophical literature. As Goodrich Clark notes, Helena Blavatsky's interest in electricity as an animating soul-like force or fluid emerged from the notion of the ether, widely discussed by scientists at the time she founded the Theosophical Society. 11, 2003, page 5. Goodrich Clark argues that these ideas eventually found their way into the Secret Doctrine in the form of the theosophical concept of thought. Far from being a concept originating in the East, he has traced its origins in Western esoteric and Western scientific schools of thought. In addition to engaging with contemporary streams of thought, H.P. Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine reveals an attempt to engage with, and appropriate, the scientific discourse. The source materials of this work are varied and include scientific works. The mode of presentation is that of a rational, argued approach to ideas. There is still the appeal to authority and special sources of knowledge. The ambiguity of the situation, therefore, cannot be ignored. My opinion remains, however, that H.P. Blavatsky's engagement with science is more than simply a facade covering unconventional, read esoteric, ideas. I am not aware of any specific study of the early theosophical presentation of Christianity, but I feel Kalinitsky has made a relevant general observation that H.P. Blavatsky presents a very generic type of Christianity. 2003, page 10512. By this I mean that she does not present a sustained study of the various forms of Christianity current in the era. Forms of Christianity current in Victorian Britain would have included Anglicanism, Baptists, Congregationalists, Quakers, Methodists, and Roman Catholicism. Most dominant forms of Christianity would have been characterized by H.P. Blavatsky as dogmatic, unscientific, authoritarian, ritualistic, and unphilosophical, atheistic. 2.1.4 Egyptology and Archaeology in the late 19th century. William H. Steibing has set out a four-step process of growth by which he characterizes the development of archaeology. They are: Phase 1, Exploration, Antiquarianism, and Early Excavation, circa 1450 to 1860. Phase 2, Archaeology comes of age, circa 1860 to 1925. Phase 3, Systematizing and Organizing the Past, circa 1925 to 1960. Phase 4, Towards a Scientific Archaeology, circa 1960 present, 1993, page 2325. The first two stages he labels the heroic age. It is into the second phase that the Theosophical Society falls. The Secret Doctrine was published in 1888. It is during this second phase that archaeology came to be seen as a potential source of information on the past, whereas, prior to this, Activity in this field was characterized as antiquity collecting. Stiebing notes that it was during the second phase that stratigraphical excavation techniques, typological sequence, dating and stratigraphically based pottery chronologies were developed. 1993, page 24. The science of archaeology, in Egyptology, was, therefore, still in an undeveloped state, only beginning to come into its own. This uncertainty, and lack of knowledge, was a fertile ground for many ideas which later scientific approaches would reject. Into this space H.P. Blavatsky would inject her theosophical content. She was, however, not alone in this process. Many interested parties would fill the gaps according to invested interests. For example, other esoteric groups like the Golden Dawn had an interest in Egyptology, as did Christian groups engaged in debates with scientists. Archaeology, like other sciences, had begun to undermine the accepted biblical chronology and dating of creation. A number of key events had occurred which contextualizes the situation in which the Theosophical Society found itself. Firstly, in the 1830s, Charles Lyell published his Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by references to causes now in action. This work showed that supernatural catastrophes were no longer needed to explain the geological shaping of the Earth. Changes happening over immense periods of time, i.e. longer than a biblical 6,000 years, could account for the geological record. The effect of this was to push back the time period of creation which again opened a space to be filled. For Theosophists, ancient, lost civilizations were read into the past. It can begin to feel like a puzzle as the various pieces seem to build a picture. The increased age of the Earth, coupled with an Egypt which seemingly had no infancy, as pre-dynastic Egypt had not been discovered, almost makes pre-existing civilizations seem illogical. Solution. A second event was the publishing in 1859 of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. The chronological space opened by Lyell's work could now be filled by Darwinian ideas of natural selection and the struggle for existence. Stiebing, 1993, page 45, The Evolution of Life from simple to complex did not entirely fit theosophical teachings, and H.P. Blavatsky was among those who could not accept the ideas in their entirety. In a move which has become almost expected, she appropriated and rejected at the same time. A third event of importance was the developing of the three-age concept. From 1836 to 1849 this concept had been developed by a Dane, Christian Jurgensen Thomson. Objects found in archaeological sites began to be grouped according to three stages of development: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Stiebing, 1993, page 47. These three developments in the history of ideas pushed back the age of the Earth and introduced an evolutionary process from simple to complex which did not require the input of any supernatural agency. It should not be thought that by this time, the late 19th century, agents of a biblical chronology had been defeated. In a very illuminating article, David Gange has shown how Egyptology of the time was informed by supporters of biblical worldviews. In a lengthy passage, which I quote in full, Gange outlines the scenario being played out. Besides Schliemann's indication of the incisiveness of archaeology, the trigger for the sudden quest for biblical verification beginning in the 1880s was the new view of prehistory proposed by evolutionary science and geology. Thus the Egyptologists in this period are suffused with attacks on both these disciplines, and the biblical criticism they informed. These sciences claimed man's intellectual capacity had undergone a constant development from primitive origins, and in the late 19th century, when the Earth was thought to be many times younger than we now know it to be, the timescale for this process had been drastically foreshortened. The argument employed by the vast majority of those who took an interest in ancient Egypt during this period was that this Civilization, the oldest to have left substantial documentation behind, could settle the issue of origins. To some, Egyptian civilization was seen to betray remnants of man's bestial state, revealing him coming down from the trees to begin the course of civilization. To others, including the biblical Egyptologists, Egypt revealed man reeling in the wake of the biblical fall, within memory of a glorious, more enlightened stage of civilization. The fact that pre-dynastic artifacts only began to be appreciated for what they were in the late 1890s was of great importance here. Before this it was widely noted that Egyptian civilization seemed to have come into existence as a fully formed, complex culture, a major blow, it was felt, to evolution. My italics. Part of the claim made by supporters of evolution in biblical criticism was that in the age of the Old Testament, when humanity was in a stage of evolution significantly less advanced than that of Victorian Britain, written language must have been relatively undeveloped, that the Pentateuch must therefore be an unreliable, even barbaric document based on centuries of distorting oral tradition before its eventual materialization in written form. Egyptologists therefore went to Egypt not just to find records of biblical events, but in search of the highly developed written culture that they were certain must exist, and that would offer a serious setback to the claims of evolutionists and biblical critics. Some Egyptologists even went so far as to resurrect the Enlightenment idea, well known from Newton's writings, that all the world's civilizations sprang from a single source in a glorious imperial super-civilization that had known divine knowledge but in its decadence had been destroyed by the Noahide deluge. Ganj, 2006, page 1089. 1090. Ganj continues by quoting from Peter LePage Renouf's Hibbert Lectures of 1878. It is incontestably true that the sublime portions of the Egyptian religion are not the comparatively late result of a process of development or elimination from the grosser. The sublime portions are demonstrably ancient, in the last stage of the Egyptian religion, that known to the Greek and Latin writers, heathen or Christian, was by far the grossest and the most corrupt. 2006, page 1090. I quote this passage in detail as it touches on many themes relevant to the theosophical perspective on ancient Egypt. The first point to note is that the birth of Egyptology as a science was not a strict movement from religious to secular knowledge. Many of the important Egyptologists had avowed biblical aims when embarking on their work. Ganj notes that Flinders Petrie went to Egypt with the hope of confirming the biblical reading of the Great Pyramid of Giza by Charles Piazzi Smith. 2006, page 1088. Theosophy, too, had a religious impulse, although not a biblical one. The second point is that many well-known and important Egyptologists espoused ideas no longer regarded as viable. The quote by Peter LePage Renouf above shows a position also held by H.B. Blavatsky, namely that Egypt knew no infancy. The theosophical value of this position, like the biblical, was to challenge Darwinism and a theory of progressive development. Each naturally suggested differing alternate readings of the past. H.P. Blavatsky notes on this theme, Donnelly has proved the fact from the clearest premises, but the evolutionists will not listen. A Miocene civilization upsets the universal Stone Age theory, and that of a continuous ascent of man from animalism. And yet Egypt, at least, runs counter to current hypotheses. There is no Stone Age visible there, but a more glorious culture is apparent, the further back we are able to carry our retrospect. Verb. Sap. 1988, Volume 2, page 786. H.P. Blavatsky continues on this theme. Even the clever work of Donnelly, already mentioned, is put aside, notwithstanding that its statements are all confined within a frame of strictly scientific proofs. But we write for the future. Discoveries in this direction will vindicate the claims of the Asiatic philosophers, who maintain that sciences, geology, ethnology, and history included, were pursued by the antediluvian nations who lived an untold number of ages ago. Future finds will justify the correctness of the present observations of such acute minds. as attained in renown. The former shows the civilizations of such archaic nations as the Egyptians, Aryans of India, Chaldeans, Chinese, and Assyrians are the result of preceding civilizations during myriads of centuries, and the latter points to the fact that Egypt at the beginning appears mature, old, and entirely without mythical and heroic ages, as if the country had never known youth. Its civilization has no infancy, and its art no archaic period. The civilization of the old monarchy did not begin with infancy. It was already mature. Plus to this Professor Arolin adds that Egypt is recorded to have been a civilized and governed community before the time of Menes and Winchell, pre-Adamites, p. 120, that at the epoch of Menes the Egyptians were already a civilized and numerous people. 1988, Volume 2, page 334-13. It is relevant to note that H.P. Blavatsky held some positions which could be supported by mainstream Egyptologists. It can also be noted that she expected vindication in the future from these scientific fields. The third point to note is the section I have italicized in the reading from Ganj above. This offers a convincing explanatory context for some of the theosophical positions on ancient Egypt. No doubt H.P. Blavatsky adopted certain positions on Egypt for polemical reasons, which suited her grand scheme. However, she could draw on contemporary sources to support her general stance. The lack of development in the science of Egyptology/archaeology opened a space for a theosophical insertion of content. H.P. Blavatsky was not alone in this. Egyptologists filled the gaps themselves. It is William Matthew Flinders Petrie who is credited with introducing modern scientific methodology into Egyptian archaeology. It was Petrie who, in the mid to late 1890s, developed the technique of typological sequence dating in Egyptian archaeology, which opened the history of pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egypt. The Egyptologist Walter Emery notes, before 1895, our knowledge of Egypt's history did not extend back beyond the reign of the pharaoh Senefru, first king of the 4th dynasty. 1961, page 21. In this context, it must be recalled that The Secret Doctrine was published in 1888, and H.P. Blavatsky passed away in 1891. Some of H.P. Blavatsky's sources for the general idea of Egypt knowing no infancy are stated by her in the passages quoted above. These sources would all predate the events which effectively discovered pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egypt. No authority could speak with any genuine certainty prior to the late 1890s on this issue, and a gap was there to be filled. The sources referenced by H.P. Blavatsky reflect the confused state of Egyptology of her time, and one wonders what sources she would have referenced had the Secret Doctrine been written 15 or 20 years later, when early Egypt was less of a mystery. Her sources are both mainstream and fringe, for example Donnelly, but, as the archaeological record could not at the time fill the gaps in the history of Egypt, they all seem legitimate. The spaces in the archaeological record of ancient Egypt in 1888 made it possible for various theories to be put forward explaining the advanced Egyptian culture of the 3rd and 4th dynasties. Included in these theories were those of immigration into Egypt of alien, advanced races from both Atlantis and the East, 14 these peoples bringing with them the arts and knowledge associated with advanced civilizations. H.P. Blavatsky included both Atlantis and the East in her Theosophical History of the Origins of the Egyptian Civilization. It is my contention that H.P. Blavatsky's statements, particularly in The Secret Doctrine, are, in the theosophical world, essentially irrefutable and cannot be false. No later theosophical writer can present a theory which is in contradiction to statements in The Secret Doctrine. 15 in example of the theosophical response to the progress made in archaeological methods can be found in John Gordon's Egypt, Child of Atlantis, published originally in 1997, and commenting specifically on the Flinders Petrie's contribution, he puts forward various reasons to reject the mainstream Egyptological stance that there was an evolution in ancient Egypt from less to more developed. These reasons include: willful ignorance on the part of Flinders. Petrie of the true Egyptian religious ideas, positive references to what are regarded as fringe. Writers on Egyptology, for example, John Anthony West and Schwaller de Lubitsch, and A. Suggestion that the pottery and artists by Flinders Petrie are not of an African type and, therefore, indicate an immigration into Egypt. It is not my intention to discuss the merits of Gordon's position. My concern is to reveal the definitive nature of the statements made by H.P. Blavatsky. The extent to which Theosophists may go to defend statements made by H.P. Blavatsky in the 19th century can lead them to, in some cases, rejecting 100 years of advances in the sciences and archaeology. H.P. Blavatsky, however, was writing during the confusing birth of a new science. She may be forgiven for, in some instances, reflecting the status of archaeology of her time. It is, perhaps, less forgivable for contemporary theosophical writers to choose consciously to exist in the late 1880s instead of the 20th century. In very broad strokes, her general position on some issues in Egyptology can be located within the framework of thought of her era. For example, Bernal notes two movements during H.P. Blavatsky's time with which she could quite easily be identified. The first is the theory that Egypt was colonized from the east, and the second is the notion that the Great Pyramid was built by peoples with sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge. 1991, page 226. At the level of specifics, however, the position becomes more complicated. When Theosophy begins to indicate timelines in the specific nature of the knowledge held by the ancients, it can become increasingly difficult to justify her position. It should also be noted that sometimes, where competing views were entertained by a specific science, Theosophy often seems to have backed the eventual loser in historical terms. I cite an example from a work by Alfred Wiedemann published in 1895. 7 years following the publication of the Secret Doctrine, in 4 years following her passing away, in his short work, The Ancient Egyptian Doctrine of the Immortality of the Soul, and referring to reincarnation, he notes, "There is no doctrine of compulsory transmigration such as used to be freely ascribed to the Egyptians on the strength of the statements made by Herodotus. Plus, there is no question here of souls being forced to assume fresh forms in which their purification is gradually worked out and their perfection achieved." 1895, page 66-67. This is a clear, near contemporary rejection of reincarnation in the Egyptian religion. 16. Reincarnation is a fundamental teaching of Theosophy, the ancient wisdom tradition, and, of necessity, therefore, of ancient Egypt in its eyes. 2.1.5 Theosophy in the East. In addition to its connection to Western esoteric streams of thought, Theosophy is intimately linked to Asia and Asian teachings. It has been pointed out that in Isis Unveiled, 1877, the general atmosphere was that of a Western, Hermetic esotericism. 17 There were certainly hints of the wisdom of the East, but this idea had not been developed in full as yet. Nor had the specific theosophical terminology been revealed at this point. By 1888, however, in the Secret Doctrine, the psychological and doctrinal move to the East had been accomplished, and the theosophical vocabulary had been developed. Certainly by 1888 the source of the theosophical wisdom tradition had been located in Tibet and the Gobi Desert area. Tibetan Buddhism had become the chief representative of the esoteric schools in public form. The two chief theosophical masters were said to be Buddhists, Tibetan, and even those theosophical masters who were linked to Western esoteric schools deferred to those in the East. The Secret Doctrine itself is suffused with Eastern terms and Eastern teachings. Mark Bever has identified the various ingredients which H.P. Blavatsky consolidated in her Theosophical presentation. Rooted in the occult tradition of Europe, she engaged with Victorian science and the Victorian interest in Asia, as well as the earlier Romantic vision of the East. He notes, she both incorporated a number of the doctrines of Eastern religions into her occultism, and interpreted Eastern religions in the light of her occultism. 1994, Page 23. This dual process of appropriation and interpretation, of incorporating and transforming, reveals also the extent of the rejection of the East which is apparent in her writings. I interpret. Interpretation here is inferring in part a rejection of the object. Nicholas Goodrick Clark has quite comprehensively contextualized the Eastern influence on Theosophy in his article, The Theosophical Society, Orientalism, and the Mystic East. Western Esotericism and Eastern Religion and Theosophy. He outlines the developments through which the East began to be revealed to the West. These include the translations of texts into English, British colonization, an interest in Sanskrit, the works of Louis-Jacques Leo and Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East. 2007, page 1113. In addition to these Western translations, special mention can be made of an early Vedantin scholar, T. Subbaro, of whom H.P. Blavatsky had a very high opinion. They were both said to have the same Theosophical master, and she had hoped he would be an early editor of the Secret Doctrine. This shift to the East in Theosophical thought has been challenged, however, on a number of fronts. 19 The extent to which Eastern ideas were actually adopted, as opposed to Western themes being injected and read into the East, is a field of debate. Hannah Graff could write, the analysis of both authors 20 led to the conclusion that Blavatsky's shift from a Hermetic to an Oriental perspective is more apparent than real. 1998, page 455. For Hannah Graff, the facade of Eastern themes and teachings cannot hide the fundamental Western origin and bias of the Theosophical teachings. Dawson can suggest, what we have is more of a Westernization of Eastern themes than an Easternization of the Western paradigm. 2006, page 3. One chief value of these critical studies on the influence of the East on the West is that they reveal the complexity of the situation and the search for the sources of theosophical ideas. Theosophical scholars have often simply engaged in a search for supporting Eastern texts and teachings which will show source identity with the theosophical statements. The academic community, by questioning the very process and nature of appropriation, suggests that the sources should be looked for not just in Eastern traditions but in a Western paradigm of thought and self-understanding. This unconscious directing and guiding influence may go some way to explaining the way in which Theosophy projected out, transformed, and even created its source material. The simple search for Eastern texts supporting the Theosophical statement would essentially be a futile one. Obviously Eastern ideas and texts were drawn on, but the manner in which they were manipulated, appropriated, and informed by the Western viewer may have deformed them to the point that source identity is not possible. 2.2 Egypt and Western Esotericism. Ancient Egypt is an important theme in the history of Western esotericism. While not the only element, it is certainly a central one. The attempt to appropriate the legitimizing authority of ancient Egypt would be central to many Western esoteric traditions. Theosophy is one of these esoteric traditions. 21 It is the very authority of Egypt in the esoteric imagination which would have forced an engagement with the developing field of Egyptology and Egyptian archaeology. Eric Horning in his book The Secret Lore of Egypt, 2001, has surveyed the Western esoteric engagement with ancient Egypt. The chapter headings of his book reveal its scope. In partial summary they include alchemy, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Rosicrucianism, Freemasons, Theosophy, and Anthroposophy. This esoteric perspective of Egypt is still extremely popular. Witness the recent works by Hancock and Bavall, etc. The esoteric/metaphysical section of any bookstore will have works making an appeal to Egyptian themes. Horning is basically skeptical of the esoteric themes which he has grouped under the label Egyptosophy. Egyptosophy is most simply understood in relation to its opposite, Egyptology proper. Egyptology is the scientific, academic study of ancient Egypt, while Egyptosophy is the Egypt of Western imagination. Many of the key themes of Western esoteric Egypt are dismissed by Horning as pure projection. These include Egypt being the source of esoteric lore, secret initiations, a separate Hermetic religion of Egypt, astrological lore, and esoteric teachings on what would later become esoteric stances, for example reincarnation. All this could be summed up by the general term Egyptian mysteries. Horning is not alone in this dismissal of a mystery tradition in Egypt in the likeness of those of, for example, Greece. 22 Georges Nagel, in an article in the Irano's yearbook, The Mysteries of Osiris in Ancient Egypt, can argue that the texts of ancient Egypt do not meet the requirements by which the classic mysteries are identified. 1955, page 132, included in these shortcomings are the lack of textual evidence for elect initiates, the fact that the Egyptian rituals were often carried out in public and in daylight, and the lack of any identifiable structure in Egyptian temples indicative of mystery work. He also sees no evidence of living men being initiated into any secret teachings. 23, 1955, page 132, Egyptian ceremonies were instead performed for the benefit of the deceased, and the Egyptian afterlife teachings were essentially funerary in nature. It is around this last point that much of the contemporary debate revolves. Brass, in his short essay, suggests that the initial, 19th century, the contextualized approach to ancient Egyptian studies left a space for competing occult and esoteric-rooted explanations to be advanced. 2004, page 2, one might ask how the esoteric perspective has survived the insights of more mainstream academic Egyptology. With the advent of Egyptology as a scientific discipline, one might have expected a narrowing of the speculative approach. That this has not happened is something bemoaned by mainstream academic Egyptology. For one thing, as pointed out by Horning, the esoteric themes have a long historical pedigree, and it is perhaps too much to expect them to disappear in a century after being entrenched in the Western mind for 2,000 years. I do also believe that the strict division between Egyptology and Egyptosophy may not always be the most useful classification. Eric Horning places Theosophy quite firmly in the Egyptosophy camp. Some theosophical positions may, however, either be legitimate in their historical context or legitimate in any Egyptological context. Esoteric and mainstream Egyptology both continued into the current era along separate lines. Egyptology as an academic science has evolved since the 19th century, and it has become more critical of alternative perspectives on ancient Egypt. The esoteric or mystical perspective in Egyptian studies, however, while on the back foot, has never entirely disappeared from the academic field. It survives in what appears to me to be a relatively specific form. The fundamental debate is whether the Egyptian texts were reserved for the use of the deceased in the afterlife, or whether there were living initiates who entered the realms of the afterlife while alive. It is at this basic level that the similarity between Theosophy and much esoteric thought and the insider perspectives of scholars like Nadler 24 end. It is only on the general level that Theosophy could draw on Nadler's ideas for support. I feel that the content-specific nature of the theosophical presentation makes it very difficult for it to draw on what, on the general level, may seem supporting perspectives. From the theosophical perspective, these general similarities may be viewed as initial steps in the eventual justification of theosophical content. The Theosophical Society does form a link in the chain of esoteric transmission. Horning has good reason to place Theosophy in this stream. It has clear roots in Gnostic, Hermetic, alchemical, Rosicrucian, and Masonic streams of thought. Many theosophical perspectives on ancient Egypt are rooted in this esoteric milieu. For example, initiations, secret knowledge, etc. An example of this in H.B. Blavatsky's writings is her references to the Krata Repoa. 25. The Krata Repoa, or Initiations into the Ancient Secret Society of the Egyptian Priests 26 was published initially anonymously in German in 1770. Its authors, later identified, Karl Friedrich Koppen and Johann Wilhelm Bernhard von Hyman, came from the Masonic milieu in Germany. The authors based this work on details about Egypt drawn from the writings of classical authors. The work outlines a sevenfold system of initiation 27 which Horning notes became the model for Egyptian initiations. 2001, page 120. H.P. Blavatsky mentions the Krater Repo and Isis Unveiled, but it is not directly referenced in the Secret Doctrine. 28 It is, therefore, difficult to assess her opinion on this work. Isis Unveiled is a different work from the Secret Doctrine. It lacks the definitive nature of the later work. The fact that mention of the Krater Repo is dropped in the Secret Doctrine may be significant. However, it is also true that H.P. Blavatsky stated it was not her intention to repeat ground covered in Isis Unveiled in the Secret Doctrine. I have not read every theosophical work which may reference the Krater Repo. It is my prediction that, as it was not mentioned in the Secret Doctrine, it has not, and will not, acquire theosophical sanction, and, while it may be mentioned by theosophical writers, it will not be vigorously defended if criticized by internal or external sources. In addition to its roots in esoteric streams of thought, it has been my contention that Theosophy is also rooted in more mainstream sources of knowledge. H.P. Blavatsky references standard works on Egyptology by well-known authorities. She held general positions which could be located in studies of her time, for example, that there was a difference in belief and understanding between educated priests and the general populace. Priests were held to hold superior/secret, read monotheistic, understandings to those of the layperson who embraced polytheism. 29 In this, then, Theosophy spans two worlds. It is a mistake in my opinion to ignore or downplay these appeals and references to mainstream sources of information in the formulation of Theosophy. Egyptology itself has undergone dramatic shifts since Champollion's work on the Rosetta Stone. Prior to the translation of Egyptian texts, Egypt was considered a source of learning and wisdom. Currently, many scholars dismiss the notion that the ancient Egyptians had special knowledge in almost any field. Jeremy Nabler discusses this gradual excising of Egyptian wisdom from the academic field of Egyptology. Nabler points out that this process was accelerated from the 1880s onward. More and more translations were being made, and the wisdom imputed to the Egyptians was being challenged. 2005, page 25. We recall again that the Secret Doctrine was published in 1888, having been in preparation for some years. It is important that the Theosophy of the Secret Doctrine be located in its historical context. The state of Egyptology at the time may in some ways explain some of the perspectives taken. Owing, however, to the developing nature of any science, it is also useful to compare the Theosophical perspective in relation to modern Egyptology. This latter comparison is what I have undertaken in this dissertation. 2.3 The Secret Doctrine, the magnum opus of H.P. Blavatsky. I have chosen to focus my dissertation around the major work of H.P. Blavatsky, The Secret Doctrine. In this section I will discuss the place of the Secret Doctrine in the Theosophical library. Related to this are the themes of authority and the methods of accessing knowledge, and how these relate to the experience of engaging with theosophical texts, specifically the Secret Doctrine. 2.3.1 The Books of H.P. Blavatsky. H.P. Blavatsky has left a large body of writings behind. Her collected works alone count more than 15 volumes, and the series does not include her major works, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. Her collected writings span the time frame from 1874 until her death in 1891. There are also some works which were published posthumously. While there are many important articles in her collected works, she is principally known for her individual works. I list the works below, with a particular emphasis on the Secret Doctrine. The work which brought H.P. Blavatsky to public attention was Isis Unveiled, a master key to the mysteries of ancient and modern science and theology, published in 1877. Published in 2 volumes, entitled Science and Theology respectively. This is a wide-ranging work. I will not review the contents of Isis Unveiled here. A few points, however, could be made. Firstly, many of the basic themes she develops in later works are outlined in this work. In this sense, the Secret Doctrine can be seen as a continuation of Isis Unveiled. Secondly, in Isis Unveiled she had not yet developed the now familiar theosophical vocabulary and terminology. The next individual work of importance is the Secret Doctrine, the synthesis of science, religion and philosophy, published in 1888. This is, without doubt, the major work of H.P. Blavatsky. Goodrich Clark notes it is the doctrinal statement of Blavatsky's mature Theosophy, which I do not feel can be doubted. 2004, page 14. It is for this reason that I have chosen to examine her statements on ancient Egypt as found in this work. H.P. Blavatsky makes many relevant statements on ancient Egypt and Isis Unveiled and in various articles throughout the collected works, but it is in the Secret Doctrine that her definitive ideas are found, and it is against these ideas that her work must be evaluated. The first volume of 2 is subtitled Cosmogenesis. It treats in general with the awakening of the universe, the solar system, the planetary chain, and the earth globe. In Theosophical theory, the general pattern of unfolding or incarnating would be similar for each system. It is divided into 3 basic sections. The first is a selection of stanzas from the Book of Zion, an esoteric work not available to the public. 30 H.P. Blavatsky had exclusive access to the secret work through the permission of the Theosophical Masters. This section also contains commentaries by H.P. Blavatsky on the verses of the stanzas. The second section is a series of chapters on symbolism and world religions as explained by Theosophical teachings. The third section is a series of chapters where science and the teachings of the Secret Doctrine are contrasted. The second volume is entitled Anthropogenesis and outlines the awakening of life, specifically human life, on the earth chain and globe. It follows the same threefold pattern of Volume 1. The first section is a selection of stanzas with commentaries by H.P. Blavatsky. The second section is a series of chapters on symbolism and world religions. The third section is a series of chapters where science and the esoteric teachings are compared. The story of the writing of the Secret Doctrine is told in Zherkov's Rebirth of the Occult tradition. It was produced under some psychic and physical distress by H.P. Blavatsky. At one point, while ill, she was visited by a Mahatma and given the choice either to die and to be freed from the burden of writing or to continue under this great distress. She chose to sacrifice for the sake of Theosophical students. Zherkov, 1977, page 3940. This sense of duress, sacrifice, and Mahatmic authority add to the charisma of the Secret Doctrine. The sense of Mahatmic authority and sanction is felt intensely around the Secret Doctrine. The work is regarded as a triple production of H.P. Blavatsky, the Mahatma Maurya, and the Mahatma Kuthumi. 31. Zherkov, 1977, page 16. Initially the Secret Doctrine was intended as an extension of Isis Unveiled. It evolved into something quite distinct, but, at that early point, H.P. Blavatsky writes, Master orders and wills it, Isis Unveiled, be rewritten. Zherkov, 1977, page 6. In one of the letters from the Masters of Wisdom the Mahatma Maurya writes, be assured that what she, H.P. Blavatsky, has not annotated from scientific and other works we have given or suggested to her. Every mistake or erroneous notion, corrected and explained by her from the works of other theosophists was corrected by me, or under my instruction. Zherkov, 1977, page 54. The Secret Doctrine was ordered, inspired, and checked by the Theosophical Mahatmas. This appeal to authority is powerful, and the nature of the work, that it is essentially factual, makes it almost irrefutable and incapable of editing. The Key to Theosophy was published in 1889. This work is a series of questions and answers on theosophical teachings which is still a standard work in the theosophical world. Also published in 1889 was The Voice of the Silence and other chosen fragments from the Book of the Golden Precepts. The Voice, as it is popularly referred to in the Theosophical Society, is the main devotional work of H.P. Blavatsky, said to be translated from hidden Works in Tibet, it is the closest she comes to any sort of meditation manual or instruction. 32. A small work entitled Gems from the East was published in 1890. The Gems from the East is a selection of saying in quotes, one for each day of the year. It can be found in volume 12 of the collected works. The esoteric section instructions were originally published in 1889 to 1890 in New York, and in 1891 in England. Goodrick Clark, 2004, page 209. These texts were initially restricted to members of the inner group or esoteric section of the Theosophical Society. They can be found in volume 12 of the collected works. This is an important collection of writings as through them, H.P. Blavatsky introduces a number of teachings not contained in the Secret Doctrine, for example, those relating to the Oric egg. There's also a collection of writings referred to as the Inner Group Teachings 33, where more select teachings were given to a few chosen students. These esoteric instructions and inner group teachings are also regarded as authoritative owing to their initially restricted nature. The Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge of the Theosophical Society was published in 1890. In 1891, this is an important work where H.P. Blavatsky provides additional commentary on some of the stanzas of Zn 34 revealed in the Secret Doctrine. A more controversial work, the Theosophical Glossary, was first published in 1892. The controversy surrounding this work is in relation to what extent H.P. Blavatsky was involved in, or sanctioned, its production. Many of the entries are not by her, and they are initialed by members of the early Theosophical Society. The Nightmare Tales and From the Caves and Jungles of Hindustan were also both published for the first time in 1892. These can be found in the collected works and Our Stories and Reminiscences. In addition to these individual works are the numerous articles contained in our 15-volume collected works. I will discuss the question of the place and authority of theosophical texts in the following section. 2.3.2 Authority in Theosophical Texts. In the Theosophical Society, authority is apportioned in accordance to proximity to the Mahatmas of Theosophy. This would be true for either persons or texts. The authoritative source of knowledge resides with the secret brotherhood of adepts, with whom contact can in theory be made. There are a range of general sources of knowledge, for example, science, philosophy, psychic investigation, religion and myth, personal investigation, but in the Theosophical world all are passed through the template of teachings given out by the Theosophical Mahatmas. The inherent nature of the Mahatmas, and of the hidden texts and teachings they reveal, makes them essentially irrefutable. Witness the following statement concerning the Secret Doctrine, meant here in its entirety, of which the Secret Doctrine is said only to be a fragment. The Secret Doctrine is the accumulated wisdom of the ages, facts which have occupied countless generations of initiated seers. The flashing gaze of those seers has penetrated into the very kernel of matter, and recorded the soul of things there. It is the uninterrupted record covering thousands of generations of seers whose respective experiences were made to test and to verify the traditions passed orally by one early race to another, of the teachings of higher and exalted beings. Blavatsky 1988, Volume 1, page 272-273. The teachings were confirmed by checking, testing, and verifying in every department of nature the traditions of old by the independent visions of great adepts, i.e., men who have developed and perfected their physical, mental, psychic, and spiritual organizations to the utmost possible degree. No vision of one adept was accepted till it was checked and confirmed by the visions, so obtained as to stand as independent evidence to other adepts, and by centuries of experiences. Blavatsky 1988, Volume 1, page 273. In terms of doctrinal authority, works penned or directly inspired by the Mahatmas would be difficult to question. Works, then, of unquestioned authority would be the Mahatma letters to A.P. Senate, and various letters the Mahatmas penned to a wide variety of correspondents. It Should be noted that the intention of the letters would be important. It is not always apparent that the intent of each letter is to reveal esoteric teachings. 35 of similar authority are translations, basically exclusively by H.P. Blavatsky, of esoteric texts and catechisms. These would include the stanzas of Zen and the Secret Doctrine, the Voice of the Silence, and, scattered throughout the writings of H.P. Blavatsky, extracts from esoteric catechisms which have been translated into English by her. 36. Next in terms of authority would be the Secret Doctrine as a whole. The stanzas and extracts from the esoteric catechism have their own inherent authority. The balance of the work, though, is also characterized by authority and finality. See Appendix 3 for examples of types of statements made in the Secret Doctrine. Following the Secret Doctrine would be books written by persons thought to have had direct contact with, or been direct chelas, students/pupils, of, the Mahatmas, for example, W.Q. Judge. It can be noted that however definitive a statement may be in terms of its origin, it may yet be a provisional statement in terms of the notion of progressive revelation. An example of this is the teaching of the auric egg as outlined in the esoteric section writings of H.P. Blavatsky. Related to this is the amended presentation of the sevenfold structure of the human being. 37 While not always presented in popular works on Theosophy, these two teachings represent a deeper understanding. As I am discussing the Secret Doctrine, I will focus on the textual implications, and not directly on the figure of H.P. Blavatsky. The place of the Secret Doctrine is in some ways ambiguous in the Theosophical Society. In written works, and even in personal discussion with members, the work is hailed as the most significant revelation of esoteric teachings for thousands of years. In actual practice, the work is not necessarily widely studied by members. This is my personal observation made in local lodges and meetings of the two main sections of the Theosophical Society, the Adyar and Pasadena sections of the Theosophical Society. In the Adyar section, the writings of Besant and Ledbetter are the chief means to access Theosophical teachings. In the Pasadena Theosophical Society, the towering figure of Gottfried de Purucker is the prism through which Theosophical teachings are often accessed. 38. The general intellectual inaccessibility of the Secret Doctrine, coupled with readily available lucid commentaries, has ensured the book is approached warily, if at all, by some members. It is my contention that the Secret Doctrine is to be understood as a set body of specific teachings. The specific nature of the presentation makes it difficult to evolve acceptably into a general abstract set of statements. For example, it is not just that reincarnation in the abstract is a theosophical teaching. By simply stating that reincarnation in general is teaching of the ancient wisdom tradition, the universal nature of the teaching is stressed. Theosophy, however, rather than making general statements, presents a detailed teaching of reincarnation, which, through this detail, makes it difficult to generalize. To elaborate, it is the theosophical contention that once human always human. Theosophy does not teach that human beings can reincarnate into lower life forms through which it has already evolved. 39 The theosophical statement is odds with, for example, the Tibetan Buddhist teaching. 40 Bearing in mind the strong links supposed by theosophists between theosophy and Tibetan Buddhism, this has resulted in internal doctrinal problems. This doctrinal discrepancy has led to various coping mechanisms within theosophy. One coping strategy is that the theosophical teaching becomes increasingly nuanced. Witness, for example, G. de Purucker's refinement of this issue. By teasing out differences in meaning between pre-existence, re-embodiment, rebirth, palingenesis, transmigration, metempsychosis, reincarnation, and metempsychosis. 1973, Volume 2, page 594. Through this refinement, discrepancies can be explained away as being select statements on a varied theme. A second coping mechanism is the stressing of the distinction between the esoteric and exoteric presentation of a teaching. In this sense, the Tibetan Buddhists would be either deliberately withholding their knowledge of the real esoteric teaching on reincarnation, or do not know it. Neither are entirely satisfactory conclusions. 2.3.3 Accessing knowledge in scientism. My chief concern in this section is to try to examine the way in which theosophical texts, specifically the Secret Doctrine, are experienced by their readers. I am not aware of any study on this topic, nor obviously have I been able to interview every member who has ever read a theosophical text. Much of what I argue here will, therefore, be my own opinion, which I will try to support by reference to the texts themselves. 41. I feel it is important to distinguish between three concepts at this point: the actual knowledge itself, the theosophical content and teachings, the means of accessing this knowledge, and the form in which this knowledge is stored. The teachings in the Secret Doctrine are rational, intellectual statements to be understood in like manner. They are not non-rational, mystical truths which require altered states of mind to be comprehended. H.P. Blavatsky had hoped that the work would revolutionize the world and provide a solid basis on which science, philosophy, and religion could base themselves. The fact that scientists and philosophers were part of its intended audience suggests to me that the work was intended to be engaged by them on their terms, that is, in terms of rational, ordered, scientific thinking. 42 I feel H.P. Blavatsky's conception of science has much in common with the crude empiricism. This method is simply projected by her into the non-empirical realms. The Secret Doctrine is presented as a scientific work of facts and truths. It is a body of knowledge. 43 H.P. Blavatsky, writing to William Quan Judge, states, "I want you badly for the arrangement of Secret Doctrine. Such facts, Judge, as masters are giving out will rejoice your old heart." Quoted in Zherkov 1977, page 27. Throughout her letters she often uses the word fact in relation to the content of the Secret Doctrine, even where the phrase higher knowledge is used in relation to secret wisdom. This knowledge is understandable on a rational, intellectual level, even when reference is made to the intuition needed to understand the esoteric wisdom. I suggest this is not some reference to supersensory mental states. For example, there is nothing more intrinsically non-rational, mystical or intuitive about a sevenfold division of a person than any other division. A sevenfold division is the esoteric division of H.P. Blavatsky's Secret School. The theosophical statements in the Secret Doctrine are primarily rational, intellectual statements, and they are to be engaged on this level. How does H.P. Blavatsky access this knowledge? To answer this question, one needs to distinguish between the types of knowledge contained in the Secret Doctrine and the form in which this knowledge exists. I propose three basic types of knowledge, or facts. Firstly, there are the esoteric commentaries and stanzas from the Book of Zion. Secondly, there are the occult interpretations of religions and their teachings. Thirdly, there are many quotes and ideas from contemporary scientific and other works of which H.P. Blavatsky makes use. The third type of knowledge clearly exists in written form. It was often remarked that H.P. Blavatsky's traveling library was small in comparison to the vast number of books referenced in the Secret Doctrine. One theosophical answer to this quandary is given by Archibald Kitely, one of the compiling assistants of the Secret Doctrine. He notes, many of the quotations had to be verified, and here we should have been lost if it had not been for a hint from HBB. She told us one night that sometimes in writing down quotations, which for the purpose of the book had been impressed on the astral light before her, she forgot to reverse the figures. For instance, page 123 would be allowed to remain 321 and so on. Quoted in Zherkov 1977, page 43. Through clairvoyant means this ordinary book knowledge is accessed, even to the point of the page numbers in the original work. Supersensory means, therefore, were used to gain normal book knowledge from the book itself. The second type of knowledge, the esoteric interpretations, is also experienced on an intellectual, rational level. In what I feel is a revealing passage, H.P. Blavatsky writes, "I live two lives again. Master finds that it is too difficult for me to be looking consciously into the astral light for my SD, and so, it is now about a fortnight, I am made to see all I have to as though in my dream. I see large and long rolls of paper on which things are written, and I recollect them. Thus all the patriarchs from Adam to Noah were given to me to see, parallel with the rishis, and in the middle between them, the meaning of their symbols, or personifications." Quoted in Zherkov 1977, pg. 25-26. While extrasensory means are used to access this knowledge, the knowledge itself is presented on long rolls of paper on which things are written. The rational and literary sense of the inspiration seems clear to me. These two types of knowledge can immediately be understood for what they are. They are self-explanatory. For example, it is understood when H.P. Blavatsky writes there are 7 principles. If she quotes from a work of a scientist, it is simple to understand it. I suggest that the first type of knowledge, content, in the Secret Doctrine is of a similar order as the other two outlined. The knowledge I refer to here is that in the stanzas of Zion themselves and the extracts from the occult, esoteric, catechism. These two, however, are literary works which H.P. Blavatsky has supposedly translated into English. She writes in the Secret Doctrine, "The stanzas which form the thesis of every section are given throughout in their modern translated version, as it would be worse than useless to make the subject still more difficult by introducing the archaic phraseology of the original, with its puzzling style and words. Extracts are given from the Chinese, Tibetan, and Sanskrit translations of the original censor commentaries and glosses on the Book of Zion, these being now rendered for the first time into a European language." 1988, Volume 1, page 23. Possibly the original Book of Zion is a work of symbols and not in the form of a normal written language. H.P. Blavatsky has, however, drawn from written works and translated out of them into the English. Once the codes and explanation of the terminology are given, the extracts become understandable on an intellectual, rational, and philosophic level. I argue, then, that the Secret Doctrine is, and was intended to be, a rational, intellectual, and literary production. The primary experience of readers of this work is on this level. That some individuals may experience the work in another manner is certainly possible, but this is not the main intent of the work, nor would it, I suggest, be the primary response to it. While non-rational means may, or may not, depending on one's perspective, have been used by H.P. Blavatsky to access these rational sources of knowledge, often in actual written form, the result is a production of rational, philosophical, and scientific scope, and H.P. Blavatsky hoped it would be assessed on this level. In relation to this presentation of the Secret Doctrine, it is relevant to examine briefly Olaf Hammer S44 notion of scientism. I believe the theosophical engagement with science is of special importance in understanding its source texts, in particular the Secret Doctrine. A few points could be noted at the outset. Firstly, the sciences cover a variety of fields, many of which were in the process of establishing themselves in the latter half of the 19th century. Science would include not just physics, but also biology, archaeology, geology, and so on. Any serious assessment of the theosophical engagement with science would need to be in relation to each of these various fields. General impressions and partial studies may not do true justice to the text being scrutinized. I am not aware of any series of studies which locates the various sciences in their historical context as they are presented in the Secret Doctrine. Secondly, H.P. Blavatsky was not a professional or practicing scientist. She did not conduct experiments in a biology laboratory, she did not conduct archaeological digs, she did not study rock formations, and one would not regard her as a physicist. Her input, then, is on the level of a lay person. She was, however, aware of the debates of her time and of the leading scientists involved in them. Thirdly, many of her works, and in particular the Secret Doctrine, drew on a wide variety of scientific works, words, and ideas. The type of engagement may range from covert adoption to overt rejection/confrontation. The attempt to present the work as scientific and on rational terms is, however, quite clear to me. That for H.P. Blavatsky science included a variety of metaphysical speculations is not the immediate point. Even these are open to science, of a different nature. 45 Furthermore, and more importantly, some of these alternate sciences and points of view were still a part of mainstream 19th century science, even if they were on the fringe. Olaf Hammer offers the following definition of scientism. Scientism is the active positioning of one's own claims in relation to the manifestations of any academic scientific discipline, including, but not limited to, the use of technical devices, scientific terminology, mathematical calculations, theories, references and stylistic features, without, however, the use of methods generally approved within the scientific community, and without subsequent social acceptance of these manifestations by the mainstream of the scientific community through, for example, peer-reviewed publication in academic journals. 2004, page 206. I return to my 3 points above. 1. I suggest that a number of H.P. Blavatsky's statement could be supported by reference to contemporary scientific works and ideas. I have mentioned 2. Goddard Clark's discussion of electricity in part drawn from the unseen universe, and, in the archaeological field, the fact that pre-dynastic Egypt was really discovered only in the late 1890s. H.P. Blavatsky has drawn on legitimate, central ideas of mainstream scientists. 2. H.P. Blavatsky is not a scientist in the usual sense of the word. She drew, however, on mainstream, among other, sources of science. I feel this could make her something of the type of a popularizer of science. Lightman mentions a number of such popularizers in the late 19th century. H.P. Blavatsky could, perhaps, fit into this category. Popularizers made use of science for their own polemical purposes, but did not have to be scientists to do so. 3. This is related to the first point. To speak of science as a uniform field without categories and specialties is an oversight. H.P. Blavatsky's statements, to be fairly assessed, need to be teased out into these categories and evaluated. A portion of H.P. Blavatsky's work in relation to the science of her day has been discussed by Eagle Asprem in his article, Pondering Imponderables, Occultism in the Mirror of Late Classical Antiquity. He makes a number of important points. 1. The relation of esotericism to the nature of science during the period of the Secret Doctrine has not been fully researched. 2. He questions the degree to which various occult systems were scientifically marginal. 2011, page 133. And 3. He notes, while her, H.P. Blavatsky synthesis is obviously speculative and, in all its expansionist vigor, questionable from the scientific point of view, it is nevertheless worth pointing out that Blavatsky's use of scientific references does not amount to simple cherry-picking. Even if the fictional real force and Crookes' psychic force were marginal, they existed within a realm of speculation where the possibility of discovering such exotic effects remained at least plausible in principle. 2011, page 144. Some, and I do not suggest all, theosophical ideas and presentations of science, of which there are many branches, would be understandable in their historical context. What I argue against here is any blanket statement on her engagement with science, or any other field of inquiry. If Theosophy is presenting a scientific occultism, it is a mistake to pin her too precisely to one half of this equation. Each of her statements should be evaluated in its full historical context. Only once this is done can a reliable opinion be presented. Theosophical ideas which have not stood the test of time may have been generated in a background of similar widespread ideas of her time, or they may have been inserted into the gaps left by still the developing sciences. H.P. Blavatsky drew information, unconsciously or consciously, from the various fields of knowledge available to her. Some of this content informs the basic theosophical concepts themselves. In addition to this, she did engage in the Secret Doctrine with various scientific works and fields of inquiry, not necessarily in any systematic way, but either as a foil for her own ideas, or when possible, as supporting literature. The Secret Doctrine is an unusual work in that it engages with various fields of knowledge. The result of this is that, in addition to being a body of knowledge, Theosophy also implies a hermeneutic approach to religion. It has something in common with the mythographies of, for example, Godfrey Higgins, Gerald Massey, Charles-François Dupuy, and Constantine François de Volney. H.P. Blavatsky debated, and was dismissed by, one of the founders of comparative religion, F. Max Muller. Theosophy, then, implies a method of interpretation, a rigorous perennial philosophy of identity. It is a rejected method, but is one which once formed part of the comparative study of religion. 2.3.4 The sources. The sources or origins of the teachings of the Secret Doctrine have not been specifically located. For many members, theosophical teachings are what they portray themselves to be: esoteric knowledge given out by advanced human beings. For scholars of religion, historical texts and contemporary thought trends would be likely sources when coupled with H.P. Blavatsky's own personal inspiration. I will review in this section some of the sources which H.P. Blavatsky references in her works, with a specific focus on ancient Egypt. 2.3.4.1 General note on sources. A few general points which are raised by H.P. Blavatsky's use of her sources can be noted. Hundreds of works are either mentioned or referenced by H.P. Blavatsky in her writings. She refers to so many works that it is almost impossible for her to have engaged in any detail with many of them. This is indeed my impression of her use of sources in relation to ancient Egypt. We do not find any systematic engagement with texts in their entirety, instead single sentences and paragraphs are drawn from a wide variety of texts to support an idea H.P. Blavatsky is presenting or for her to refute. An example of this is found in the Secret Doctrine, where she writes, as Bojij, J. Basnage de Beauval, shows, the Egyptians themselves confessed that science flourished in their country only since Isis Osiris, whom they continue to adore as gods, though they had become princes in human form. And he adds of Osiris Isis, the divine androgyne, it is said that this prince, Isis Osiris, built cities in Egypt, stopped the overflowing of the Nile, invented agriculture, the use of vine, music, astronomy, and geometry. 1988, Volume 2, page 366. This short extract is drawn from J. Basnage de Beauval's Histoire des Juifs. 46. It appears to be the sole extract from Basnage and is drawn on to support H.P. Blavatsky's larger theme of divine instructors teaching early humanity. There is no attempt to engage with this topic as expressed in this work. It is simply a sentence quoted as if authoritative. Partially related to this is the accusation of plagiarism. A famous accusation was published by William M. Coleman in 1895 as an appendix to a work by Vsevolod Sergeyevich Solovyov entitled, A Modern Priestess of Isis. 47 Coleman's accusation, in his own words, is I have traced the sources whence she, H.P. Blavatsky, derived, and mostly without credit being given, nearly the whole of her writings, subject matter. 2004, page 1, the basic accusation is twofold. Firstly, that her ideas have been taken from various authors, and secondly, that no proper credit was given. A third accusation is also mentioned, viz., that H.P. Blavatsky gave the erroneous impression that she was quoting directly from many sources, when, in fact, she drew the passages from a third-party text. A false impression was thereby being given of vast erudition on the part of H.P. Blavatsky. There does appear to be some justification for this accusation. Coleman's article is very wide-ranging and cannot be assessed here. I will, however, mention two examples from H.P. Blavatsky's writings as they pertain to her use of sources on ancient Egypt. One example is found in the Secret Doctrine Volume 1, page 311. H.P. Blavatsky extracts a lengthy passage which she attributes to M. Gaston Maspero by name, although she does not mention the work drawn from. 48 It is, therefore, a partial reference. The purpose of the passage being quoted appears to be solely that it can be disagreed with by H.P. Blavatsky. The thrust of the passage by Maspero is to suggest the Egyptian religion changed over time. Immediately following the quoted passage, H.P. Blavatsky disagrees with almost every idea in it. For her, naturally, the esoteric teachings of the Egyptians have not changed and are incapable of change. It is difficult to say what idea she appropriated from this passage of Maspero. It is quoted for seemingly no other reason than to be contradicted. I have noticed this same pattern throughout the Secret Doctrine. A passage from an author will be quoted, with often a partial reference, or a reference in the vicinity of the passage, only to be either rejected or wholly reinterpreted in a theosophical light. Coleman suggested that most of the details on Egyptian mythology presented in the Theosophical glossary were drawn from Bonwick's Egyptian belief in modern thought. It is beyond the scope of this dissertation to examine every entry. What I do note, however, is that Bonwick's work quotes from H.P. Blavatsky's own Isis Unveiled. Bonwick drew on Isis unveiled in his work, and his own possible borrowings would need to be teased out before any absolute conclusion could be made, not perhaps in terms of whether H.P. Blavatsky drew passages from his work, but whether she drew ideas from his works. An example of the complexity of this might be shown to be revealed in the following passage from the Secret Doctrine. The use of geometrical figures and the frequent allusions to figures in all ancient scriptures, see Puranas, Egyptian papyri, the Book of the Dead, and even the Bible must be explained. 1988, Volume 1, page 66. Bonwick notes in his Egyptian Belief in Modern Thought, geometrical figures had their significance. 1956, page 213. It could be that H.P. Blavatsky drew this idea into her Secret Doctrine and elaborated on and developed it. It might, however, also be that this idea was current in any number of circles at the time. We do know also that Bonwick's work post-dated Isis Unveiled, and one would need to investigate potential borrowings by Bonwick. My main point is that the situation seems complicated, and quick judgments may not be correct. Plagiarism 49 is a complicated accusation which would take careful research to sustain or deny. While H.P. Blavatsky may quote from many contemporary and ancient sources, it is often to disagree with them or to reinterpret them in a totally new light. In such a case, the passages may be said to be plagiarized, but the ideas they now express cannot. Scholars have not unanimously located the precise sources of the basic theosophical ideas, and it is these basic ideas which need to be located in our contemporary sources for the charge of plagiarism to have any sting. To assess the accusations of Coleman, one would need to follow through on his ideas virtually quotation by quotation and confirm whether each was not referenced in some way and whether the content was actually drawn on by H.P. Blavatsky or merely used as a foil for her own ideas. 2.3.4.2 Specific individuals. Above I refer to a single passage H.P. Blavatsky drew from a work by J. Bosnaj de Beauval's Histoire des Juifs. There are authors, however, from whom she drew more consistently when dealing with ancient Egypt. I will sketch some basic bibliographical and biographical details of these writers in this section. In relation to the specific topic of my dissertation, two important writers stand out. The first is Gerald Massey, and the second is Franz Lambert. The editor of the Blavatsky's collected works, Boris Zerkov, gives fairly thorough biographical and bibliographical information for Gerald Massey in the collected works. Volume 8. Massey, born in England in 1828, was a poet and self-taught Egyptologist. In terms of his work in the field of Egyptology, he is chiefly known for three works: A Book of the Beginnings, The Natural Genesis in Ancient Egypt, The Light of the World. 50 The last, being published in 1907, It formed no part of H.P. Blavatsky's sources. Of a special relevance too. H.P. Blavatsky is his series of lectures. In terms of the topics of this dissertation, his lecture, entitled, The Seven Souls of Man, and Their Culmination in Christ, is the most important. Some of her quotations from the Book of the Dead do appear to have been drawn from this article and not directly from the Egyptian text itself. For example, it is quite clear that H.P. Blavatsky is drawn from Massey's Lectures in the Secret Doctrine, page 634-635. It is not concealed, and his name is mentioned in this context. Of more relevance to my dissertation is that H.P. Blavatsky had an ambivalent attitude towards his work. Following a basic pattern, she both appropriates and rejects at the same time. In many ways, some of the extracts are quoted only to be reinterpreted by her in a theosophical light. For example, what the lecturer, Massey, takes for a mode of expression and nothing more. In the Egyptian ritual, we take as having quite another and an important meaning. Here is one instance. Says the ritual, the Book of the Dead I am the mouse. I am the hawk. I am the ape. I am the crocodile whose soul comes from men. I am the soul of the gods. Of these last two sentences, one, whose soul comes from men is explained by the lecturer, who says parenthetically, that is, as a type of intelligence. And the other, I am the soul of the gods, as meaning, the Horus, or Christ, as the outcome of all. The occult teaching answers, it means far more. 1988, Volume 2, pg. 634-635. H.P. Blavatsky goes on to explain how these extracts actually corroborate certain theosophical ideas relating to the root races, rounds, and the cycling of the human monad through nature. None of these ideas are to be found in Massey's works. In fact, Gerald Massey in this lecture 51 quite specifically disagreed with basic theosophical teachings as given out in Esoteric Buddhism of A.P. Sinnett. Massey was opposed to any esoteric thought as expressed in theosophical works, a point he continually makes in his lecture The Seven Souls of Man, and Their Culmination in Christ. In 1891, H.P. Blavatsky addressed a letter to Gerald Massey on this issue in the Agnostic Journal. In this letter she lauds Massey as a great Egyptologist, praising him, but also distances herself from his work. She notes, I take your Egyptian aspect in toto, and only add to it the Aryan and what they would call the Turanian aspects. 1891, page 2. She is inserting the theosophical, Aryan/Eastern, esoteric, content into the Egyptian texts and into Massey's writings. She goes on, never mind that you differ from us in our views. What matters it that your conclusions are opposed to ours, when all your fundamental premises are identical and the same. 1891, page 2. H.P. Blavatsky has quoted from a work, but has, at the same time, rejected it on many theosophical interpretive levels. This ambivalent stance toward contemporary authors was taken throughout many of her writings. Massey for his part appears to have essentially rejected any esoteric or theosophical content. The writings of Franz Lambert appear also to be an important source used by H.P. Blavatsky. In her writings, H.P. Blavatsky quoted from, and drew on, journal articles by Franz Lambert in The Secret Doctrine and in an article entitled The Psychology of Ancient Egypt in her Collected Works Volume 10. I have been unable to source any biographical details for this figure. The Collected Works, normally a reliable source, has an entry which shows only that Franz Lambert contributed articles to a metaphysical journal, The Sphinx. The Sphinx was a monthly metaphysical journal originally founded and edited by an important early theosophist, Dr. William Hubschleiden. The journal ran from 1886 to 1896 with the article referred to by H.P. Blavatsky, Die Eltagif apostrophe 52, appearing in it in 1887. The Sphinx is a difficult periodical to get hold of, and I have not been able to do so. The Library of Congress catalog shows a complete microfilm copy. The Theosophical Society Pasadena Library indicated they had some volumes in their collection, but the condition was such that they could not be scanned or faxed. A few of Lambert's articles have been translated in sister Theosophical periodicals. The above-mentioned article was translated into French in the Theosophical Journal La Lotus in 1888. A second article, 3,000 years ago, Hypnotism and Electricity in Ancient Egypt, was translated into English in the Theosophist in 1892. A scholar in the field Egyptology which H.P. Blavatsky quite frequently references was Baron Christian Charles Josiah von Bunsen, born 1791, d. 1860. This Prussian diplomat published an enormous work on ancient Egypt entitled Ägypten Stele in der Weltgeschichte. This work was translated by C.H. Cottrell as Egypt's Place in Universal History from 1848 to 1867. This large work, published in 5 volumes, is important for theosophical history for, among other things, containing the English translation of the Book of the Dead by Samuel Birch. It is this translation which was used by H.P. Blavatsky in her Isis Unveiled. It is difficult to assess such a huge work in relation to its importance to H.P. Blavatsky. It would require a dissertation in itself to go through this work of 3,500 pages and compare it to H.P. Blavatsky's position on various Egyptian themes. Following the references made in the Secret Doctrine to his work, my general impression remains that she used writers to back up her existing position where possible. H.P. Blavatsky, however, always seems to go a step further than any of her sources. In various places she quotes dates given by Bunsen on, for example, the age of the pyramid, of Menes and of Egyptian civilization, but his dates are dwarfed by H.P. Blavatsky's own opinion on these issues. In addition to the above, and to versions of the Egyptian Book of the Dead discussed below, brief reference can be made to some of the other works on Egypt which H.P. Blavatsky referenced. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list. Instead, I draw attention to some of the more frequently referenced works. I will focus on the Secret Doctrine. 53. And the Secret Doctrine reference is made to the origin and significance of the Great Pyramid. 54. By C. Stanley and Wake. It is difficult to assess H.P. Blavatsky's use of this work. She draws on only isolated passages from it. In some instances her theosophical perspective matches that of Wake's, linking of the pyramid to the zodiac, while in others she differs from him, dating of the Great Pyramid. Complicating the issue is that by the time the Secret Doctrine was written, the identifying theosophical teachings were essentially in existence. The Secret Doctrine is involved in a secondary process of interpretation and appropriation to establish itself in the public arena. For example, Wake links the Pyramid of Cheops with the figure of Set/Seth. In theosophical thought, Set/Seth, amongst other associations, is interpreted as signifying a stage of development of the entire human race, the later third race. Other works deserving mention are Maspero's Guide du Visiteur au Musée de Bolac 55. Mariette Bey's Abitus, Description des fouilles exécutées sur l'emplacement de cette ville 56, de Merville's Pneumatology 57, de Rouge's Journal Article Études sur le rituel funéraire des Anciens Egyptians published in the Revue Archéologique 58, Leipzig's Denkmalhaus. Egyptian und Ethiopian 59, Shubaz's Papyrus Magique Harris 60, Champollion's Pantheon Égyptien 61, Jablonski's Pantheon Egyptiorum 62, Skinner's Source of Measures 63 and Mackay's Mythological Astronomy of the Ancients demonstrated 64. Other individual works could be mentioned. H.P. Blavatsky's use of these works, however, much like those listed above, remain fragmentary. H.P. Blavatsky drew from a wide variety of sources, whether directly or indirectly through third-party references. She does not engage with any set work in detail. Instead, she selects quotations and passages which support her general ideas. In some cases, the support is limited, and extracts are quoted simply because they dispute accepted ideas which H.P. Blavatsky is also interested in challenging. She appropriates and rejects at the same time, always locating the esoteric tradition as the center of authority. 65 She is, however, concerned to present her ideas as scientific, objective, rational, and supported by other scholars. I do not feel this point should be minimized. The larger discourse of science was the most challenging and powerful, and she sought to appropriate its power and authority. As this is the level at which she attempted to work, it is on this level that her work should be judged. By the time H.P. Blavatsky was writing The Secret Doctrine, however, her focus had turned from the West to the East. Egypt had assumed a smaller supporting role to the Eastern ideas which she now embraced. 2.4 The Egyptian Book of the Dead. This important Egyptian text still captures the imagination. I examine it here in theosophical and academic circles. 2.4.1 The Egyptian Book of the Dead in the writings of H.P. Blavatsky. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is easily the most well-known Egyptian text in the popular imagination. It is the chief Egyptian text that H.P. Blavatsky, and virtually all later Theosophists, references in her works. This is true for her two major works, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. Eric Horning observes that in esoteric circles the Egyptian Book of the Dead remains the central Egyptian text referred to. He notes, however, that the emphasis in mainstream Egyptology moved from this work to the pyramid texts in the last 20 years of the 19th century. 66 The reason for the adjustment and emphasis was that the pyramid texts were regarded as much earlier and, therefore, more primary text than the Book of the Dead. Under the reference for Book of the Dead, the Theosophical Glossary has the following entry: an ancient Egyptian ritualistic and occult work attributed to Thoth Hermes, found in the coffins of ancient mummies. Blavatsky, 1990, page 61. For H.P. Blavatsky, the Book of the Dead is certainly ancient and certainly occult. In terms of the title of the work, H.P. Blavatsky in the main refers to the Book of the Dead. It can also be referenced in her works as the Ritual, or the Egyptian Ritual, or the Funerary Ritual, or the Bible of the Egyptians. These titles refer to early conceptions of Egyptologists on this work, for example Champollion and de Rouge. She does not refer to the work by its more common modern translation of the Book of Coming Forth by Day. In this she does not differ dramatically from the Egyptology of her time. Drawing on Bunsen 67, H.P. Blavatsky regards the Book of the Dead as ancient. It precedes the figure of Menes which, referencing Bunsen, is dated to either 3059 BC or 4000 BC. 68. These are not her dates for Menes, which, following other references in her works, I would argue she places around 8000 to 11,000 BC. The Book of the Dead is, therefore, not specifically dated by her. In her understanding, the writings found in the pyramids, pyramid texts, and on coffins, coffin texts, draw from the Book of the Dead. 69 The Book of the Dead is seen by her as fully formed and complete. This is seen by her as proof of the antiquity of the Egyptian civilization. With this opinion she occupies the reverse position of the current conceptions of Egyptology, where the Book of the Dead is a later compilation which draws on the earlier inscriptions found in pyramids and on coffins. For H.P. Blavatsky, the Book of the Dead is an esoteric work, or one which is open to esoteric interpretation. In various places she states the book is full of symbology, and she notes, in the Egyptian papyri the whole cosmogony of the Secret Doctrine is found scattered about in isolated sentences, even in the Book of Dead. Blavatsky 1988, Volume 1, pg. 674. Her later writings, however, reveal the place of the Book of the Dead and of Egyptian civilization. It has become subordinate to the East and its teachings. She notes in 1891. Now the main point of Volume 3 of The Secret Doctrine is to prove, by tracing and explaining the blinds in the works of ancient Indian, Greek, and other philosophers of note, and also in all the ancient scriptures, the presence of an uninterrupted esoteric, allegorical method in symbolism, to show, as far as lawful, that with the keys of Interpretation as taught in the Eastern Hindu-Buddhistic canon of occultism, the Upanishads, the Puranas, the Sutras, the epic poems of India and Greece, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, all, from first to last, yield a meaning quite different from their dead letter texts. Blavatsky 1982, Volume 13, page 146. The esoteric teachings of the Egyptians are to be revealed by the keys of their own original founders, the secret teachings of the East. The magical aspect of the Book of the Dead is commented on by H.P. Blavatsky. Seen in a positive light, as it would reveal the esoteric content, she expects Egyptologists to dismiss or misunderstand the magical element in the text. 70. We might expect an esoteric organization to have a positive perspective on magic and its attendant obscure ideas. This can function as a space of mystery open to interpretation and the insertion of theosophical content. Boris Zerkov has identified the translations of the Book of the Dead drawn on by H.P. Blavatsky. 71. Isis Unveiled. She drew on Samuel Birch's English translation, which is contained in Bunson's Egypt's Place in Universal History. In The Secret Doctrine, the Zerkov identifies P. Pierre's French translation, A Livre des Morts des Anciens Egyptiens, published in 1882.72. Of interest to the English-speaking theosophical world is that Pierre's French translation has been, in turn, translated into English. 73. In 1894, Charles H. S. Davis published The Egyptian Book of the Dead, the most ancient and the most important of the extant religious texts of ancient Egypt, edited with introduction, a complete translation and various chapters on its history, symbolism, etc. etc. The works by both Birch and Pierre works are translations of the so-called Turin Papyrus. 2.4.2 The Egyptian Book of the Dead in Egyptology. The earliest corpus of Egyptian texts is referred to as the Pyramid texts. They are attested from the last king of Dynasty 5 to about Dynasty 8. These writings were carved in primarily royal pyramids in the burial chamber and antechamber. Eric Horning notes that these texts came to light when Gaston Maspero conducted his excavations in 1881 to 1882. I feel that the point to note here is that the field of Egyptology was in its infancy in the late 19th century when H.P. Blavatsky was writing. Some of her positions reflect ideas of what was at that time mainstream Egyptology, but which were subsequently to evolve as new texts became translated. The idea of an evolution in understanding new knowledge is important in relation to Egyptology, and I suspect in many other fields of knowledge, Theosophy is stuck in a sort of time warp. Still referenced in current theosophical works are 19th century ideas and prejudices. One potential reason for this is the authority of H.P. Blavatsky in her place in the Theosophical Society. Works she references, and ideas she engages with, are still those dealt within current theosophical texts. 74 Without authoritative permission, the Theosophical Society struggles to go beyond the ideas of the founder. It might also be noted that H.P. Blavatsky shows no special knowledge or special access to any known Egyptian text. Her means of inserting and displaying knowledge is through reference to esoteric works not available to the general public and through symbolical interpretation of known works. In chronological order, the next corpus of Egyptian texts is referred to as the coffin texts. The name refers to the fact that the majority of these texts were inscribed on the coffins of the deceased. They began to supersede the pyramid texts from the beginning of the Old Kingdom. It was toward the end of the New Kingdom that the coffin texts were, in turn, superseded by the Book of the Dead and other books of the underworld. These writings drew on the earlier pyramid texts, with the addition of new spells. A further democratization occurred over this period as the texts began to make clear that all deceased, and not just the king, would enjoy the afterlife. The king, however, did remain distinct from the private individual in both life and death. Taylor, 2001, page 195. These texts also became more prominent, and better researched and understood, well after H.P. Blavatsky's passing away. The Egyptian Book of the Dead came into prominence in the New Kingdom, and continued through the Third Intermediate Period in the Late Period. Horning, 1999, page 13. The Book of the Dead is not one single uniform work. It is a collection of spells which were mainly recorded on papyrus and placed in the grave with the deceased. The deceased in the tomb would ideally be buried with a copy of this work. Depending on what the deceased could afford, the size and quality of the text could differ. More complete versions may have had up to 200 spells, while for less grand versions a shorter selection of spells would be selected. The Book of the Dead drew from the spells of the earlier pyramid texts and coffin texts and also added new material. H.P. Blavatsky appears to see this process in reverse. She suggests that the inscriptions on the pyramids and coffins are drawn from the Book of the Dead which preceded them. For mainstream Egyptology, the Book of the Dead, being a comparatively late production in comparison to the pyramid text, absorbed many of the earlier inscriptions into its framework. As it is a later text, it may appear to be more evolved and complex than the earlier writings. H.P. Blavatsky, by placing the Book of the Dead at the beginning of the historical Egyptian period, needs to justify its completeness by looking still further into the past, to unknown civilizations. As noted above, H.P. Blavatsky drew on the translations of Birch and Pure. Both these translations are based on the work of Carl Richard Lepsius. In 1842 Lepsius published a Ptolemaic manuscript from Turin, the Papyrus of Iuafhank. Taylor, 2010, page 289. His work, entitled Das Totenbuch der Ägypter nach dem hieroglyph-lined Papyrus in Turin, introduced the term Book of the Dead, Totenbuch, into the field. His work also formed the basis for Birch's English translation in 1867, incorporated in Bunsen's Egypt's place in universal history, and for Pierre's French translation in 1882. 2.5 Conclusion. This second chapter is intended as a general background, contextualizing statement. In relation to the various streams of thought the Theosophical Society existed in, I have sketched only an outline. Where possible, I have used H.P. Blavatsky's statements on ancient Egypt to illustrate a point. This general background, however, does not exist only in relation to her statements on ancient Egypt. It would instead have general applicability to the theosophical presentation as a whole. Theosophy's relationship with these other streams of thought may, however, reveal different characteristics to those shown in relation to Egypt. The theosophical teachings of H.P. Blavatsky are a child of their time. While the precise origins are unknown and possibly unknowable, the Theosophical Society and its teachings show sufficient links with various cultural, religious, philosophic, occult, and scientific trends in the late 19th century to be recognizable. It both drew on these institutions and confronted them on a variety of levels. Many of these institutions were in a developmental stage, and the quickly changing nature of, for example, the sciences allowed for competing ideas and left gaps to be filled. While the sciences in H.P. Blavatsky time sometimes allowed for competing ideas, some of which are more in harmony with theosophical ideas, it can seem that Theosophy often endorsed the losing side. Examples might be the concept of the ether in physics, and how the individual was viewed in ancient Egypt by academics of her day. Rooted in the very structure of the Theosophical Society and the theosophical teachings are countercurrents of a democratic and elitist emphasis. The origin of this tension may, to a large extent, be located in the differing personalities of the two founders of the society. These tensions, as they are embodied in the written text, show a leaning towards an authoritarian stance. This may in large part be because many of the important texts of the society were penned by H.P. Blavatsky. The Secret Doctrine, in particular, H.P. Blavatsky's defining work, is presented as a body of factual knowledge. This rational, literary text is content-specific in the sense that many of its statements are not open to real refutation. The statements are too definite and defined to be contradicted. The aura of authority and charisma surrounding the text removes it from the Open democratic trends in the society. The definitive character of many of the statements reflects the adoption of the scientific discourse into the Secret Doctrine by H.P. Blavatsky. The ambiguous relationship with science, however, and a wide variety of fields of knowledge need careful study to determine the actual relationship between them. The literary sources, in a wide variety of fields, of H.P. Blavatsky are both mainstream and French, esoteric. The dominant ideas she engages with also reflect a wide variety of origins. She engages with them in various ways, and I intend to examine this engagement in more detail in the following chapter.